Welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we are going somewhere that feels less like a place and more like a dream, a city that was not built on top of the earth, but carved into it. A civilization that rose from one of the most hostile landscapes on the planet, became one of the wealthiest crossroads in the ancient world, and then, quietly, without war, without fire, without a single conqueror tearing down its walls, it simply faded. The stone remained. The people did not. We are going to Petra, and we are going to take our time getting there. Tonight's story is long. It deserves to be. Because Petra was not built in a single century. It took hundreds of years for this city to become what it was. It took hundreds more for the world to forget it existed. And when explorers finally stumbled back into its red canyons in the early 1800s, they stood in silence, unable to fully believe what they were seeing. So we are going to trace this city from its very beginning, from the ancient nomads who first looked at a canyon in the desert and thought it might be home, through the rise of the Nabataean Kingdom, the merchants and traders and architects who carved palaces into sandstone cliffs, through the long relationship with Rome, the slow shift of trade routes, the silencing of the caravan bells, and finally, the centuries of emptiness, when the desert reclaimed the canyon and the world moved on without it. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Before we can talk about Petra, we have to talk about the land it lives in, because the land is part of the story. It is not backdrop, it is character. In the southwestern corner of what is today the country of Jordan, there is a stretch of high desert plateau that the ancient world called Edom. It is a harsh and beautiful place. The ground is red, not painted red, not reddish-brown, but genuinely, deeply, vividly red. The way a sunset is red, the way dried blood is red, the way fire leaves stone red when it is burned long enough and hot enough. The sandstone here has been carved by millions of years of wind and rain and underground water into impossible shapes. Towers of stone rise without warning from flat desert floors. Canyons cut so deep and so narrow that standing at the bottom, you cannot tell what time of day it is, because only a thin ribbon of sky is visible above you. The walls of these canyons catch the light differently at every hour. In the morning they are pale gold, at noon they burn orange, in the afternoon they go deep rose, and at sunset they turn a shade of red so intense that travelers have been known to stop walking and simply stare. This is not comfortable land. It receives very little rain. The temperatures swing from blistering heat during the day to genuine cold at night. Water is scarce. Agriculture is difficult. For most of human history, this plateau and its canyons were considered the edges of the world. The kind of place you crossed quickly on your way somewhere else, if you could find the path. But hidden inside this landscape, there was something extraordinary, a natural fortress. A hidden valley surrounded on all sides by walls of stone so sheer and so high that it was almost inaccessible unless you knew exactly where to look. And the only way in, for most of its history, was through a crack in the rock so narrow that two camels could barely walk side by side. The ancient world called this crack the Seek, and beyond the Seek, sheltered from wind and invaders and the worst of the desert heat, there was a valley with reliable springs of fresh water and soil that could, with effort, support life. People found this place thousands of years before Petra became Petra. The earliest evidence of human habitation in and around the Petra Basin goes back to the Neolithic period. Small groups of hunter-gatherers sheltered in the natural caves and overhangs of the canyon walls. They left behind flint tools, the bones of animals they ate, and in some caves, faint traces of painted marks on stone. They were not building a city, they were surviving. But they were there, in those red canyons, living alongside the rock, and the rock would remember them. Later, during the Bronze Age, there is evidence of a more settled community in the area. A site called Petra, just north of the Petra Valley, contains the remains of one of the oldest known villages in the world, dating back more than 9,000 years. The people there built circular stone houses, kept animals, grew some crops, and traded with communities across the region. Petra was not Petra, but it tells us that this part of the desert was not as empty as it sometimes appears. People kept coming back to this valley, The water brought them. The walls of stone protected them. The position, sitting at the crossroads of several ancient trade routes, gave them reason to stay. By the Iron Age, the canyon and the surrounding plateau were home to a people the Hebrew Bible called the Edomites. In ancient texts, Edom is described as a kingdom of herders and traders, a people who controlled the mountain passes between the Arabian Peninsula and the lands of the Mediterranean coast. They had a capital, a fortified city on a high plateau called Bozrah, some distance to the north of where Petra would eventually rise. But they also knew the Petra Valley. It was called, in some ancient sources, Sela, which simply means the rock, and it was used as a place of refuge, a place to retreat to when enemies came down from the north or the west. The Edomites existed in constant tension with their neighbours, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah to the northwest, the Moabites to the north, the desert tribes to the south and east. They were mountain people, tough and independent, deeply familiar with their landscape in the way that only people who have lived somewhere for generations can be. They knew which canyon held water in the dry season. They knew which pass could be defended by a handful of men against 100. They knew the stars the way people know stars when there are no lights to dim them, when the desert sky at night is so full of light that it looks heavy. The Edomites would eventually fade from history, absorbed into larger empires, scattered by conquest, their kingdom broken. But the valley they called Sela remained. And into that valley, sometime in the centuries before the Common Era, came a new people, a people who would transform the rock into something the world had never seen before. They called themselves the Nabataeans. The origins of the Nabataeans are genuinely mysterious. Ancient sources describe them as an Arabian people, nomads who came from somewhere in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. They spoke a form of Arabic, though they wrote in a script derived from Aramaic, the common language of trade across the ancient Near East. They were not farmers. They were not city builders, not at first. They were desert people, herders and caravan traders, people who understood how to move through landscapes that killed anyone who did not understand them. The earliest Greek description of the Nabataeans comes from a historian named Diodorus Siculus, who was writing in the 1st century BCE but drawing on older sources. He described them as a people who lived in the open desert, who had no permanent homes, who did not drink wine, and who kept no slaves because, in a place where survival required everyone to work, no one could afford to be idle. He described them as fierce and independent, resistant to any attempt to conquer or settle them. He told a story of a Seleucid military commander, a general named Antigonus, who twice sent armies into the desert to subdue the Nabataeans. Both times, the Nabataeans retreated into the desert, scattered their flocks, hid their families in the canyon stronghold, and waited. The armies, unable to find food or water in the desert, were forced to retreat. One expedition was ambushed in the night while the soldiers slept, and thousands of men were killed or captured. The Nabataeans sent back a message with the surviving prisoners: "We do not want war, but we will not submit." This early portrait of the Nabataeans is important because it tells us who they were before they built anything, before the temples and the tombs, before the elaborate water systems and the painted plaster and the rose-red facades carved into living rock. They were desert people who understood that survival in a harsh landscape required intelligence, flexibility, and absolute knowledge of your terrain. These qualities would shape everything they built. At some point, probably in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, the Nabataeans began to settle more permanently in the Petra Valley. The reasons were partly geographic and partly economic. The valley was defensible, it had water, and it sat at the intersection of several important trade routes that were becoming more and more valuable as the ancient world grew more connected. Trade in the ancient world was not abstract. It was the movement of physical goods across enormous distances by human beings and animals who walked through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The goods that moved along these routes were the luxuries that wealthy people in the Mediterranean world could not live without. Incense, frankincense and myrrh, harvested from trees in what is today southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Spices from India, cinnamon and pepper and cardamom that arrived at Arabian ports after crossing the Indian Ocean. Silk from China, carried across the Central Asian steppes. Precious metals, dyes, ivory, exotic animals. And from the opposite direction, the wines and olive oils and textiles and metalwork of the Mediterranean world flowing south and east into Arabia. The Nabataeans sat right in the middle of all of it. The main incense route, the road along which frankincense and myrrh traveled from their sources in southern Arabia to the ports of the Mediterranean, passed directly through their territory. The road from the Red Sea coast up through the mountains to the ports of Gaza and the Mediterranean also passed near their valley. Control these routes, and you controlled enormous wealth, not by raiding caravans, though that had certainly happened in earlier centuries, but by providing something even more valuable: safety, water, shelter, a marketplace. The Nabataeans became, in essence, the masters of desert logistics. They knew where every water source was along the routes through their territory. They built cisterns, carved into rock, hidden underground, to store rainwater from the rare winter rains. They built stopping places, caravanserais, where merchants could water their animals and rest before the next leg of the journey. And they charged for all of it. A percentage of every load that passed through their territory went to the Nabataean treasury. Over time, this toll became the foundation of extraordinary wealth. And at the center of their network, at the heart of their territory, in the Red Valley with its hidden springs and its impenetrable canyon walls, they began to build their city. The earliest Petra was not the Petra that travelers see today. The city grew slowly, across many generations, from a simple settlement of tents and temporary shelters into something increasingly permanent. The Nabataeans were not born architects. They became architects because the stone demanded it. The sandstone of the Petra Valley is remarkable stuff. It is soft enough to carve with relatively simple tools, but hard enough to hold its shape for centuries after it is carved. It does not crumble easily. It does not absorb water the way some stones do, which means carved surfaces remain sharp even after long exposure to the elements. And it is layered in colors in a way that is almost impossible to describe without seeing it. The stone is not uniformly red. It is striped in swirling bands of red and orange and yellow and white and purple and pink, the layers of ancient geological time compressed and folded and turned sideways by millions of years of tectonic movement. When a Nabataean craftsman cut into the face of a cliff, he never quite knew exactly what colors would emerge from inside the stone. The first permanent structures the Nabataeans built at Petra were probably not the elaborate facades that are famous today. They were practical things: cisterns to collect and store water, simple rooms carved into cliff faces as storage spaces or shelters. The great engineering achievement of early Petra was not architectural grandeur, it was water. Water, in the desert, is everything. The Petra Valley had springs, but springs alone could not support the size of a growing city and the constant flow of thousands of camel caravans passing through. The Nabataeans developed one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world. They carved channels into the rock faces of the canyon walls to direct rainwater and spring water into networks of underground cisterns. They built ceramic pipes, fitted together along the walls of the Sikh, to carry water from distant springs. They built dams in the side wadis, the seasonal riverbeds, to catch flash flood water before it could drain away. They carved hundreds of cisterns of varying sizes throughout the city, each one positioned to catch water from the channels above it. By the peak of Petra's development, the city could store enough water to supply a population of tens of thousands, plus the animals of passing caravans, through even an extended dry season. This was not magic, it was engineering. It was the accumulated knowledge of a desert people who had been thinking about water their entire existence. As the water infrastructure made permanent settlement possible, the city began to grow. Temples were built, markets developed. The great plateau at the center of the valley, what would eventually become the colonnaded street and forum of Petra, became a place of commerce and public life. And the cliffs surrounding the valley became the canvases on which the Nabataeans expressed something remarkable. The carved facades of Petra began as relatively simple forms. Early tomb and shrine facades cut into the cliff faces reflect the architectural styles of the surrounding ancient world. You can see, in the oldest Nabataean facades, influences from Egypt, from the Hellenistic world, from Mesopotamia, The Nabataeans were traders, and like all great traders, they absorbed ideas from everywhere they went and everything they touched. Their art and architecture is a kind of record of every culture that ever passed through their city. But over time, the Nabataean style became its own thing. Distinctly recognizable, the step tops, the elegant proportions, the way the facades frame their doorways, the particular relationship between carved decoration and plain stone. Nabataean architecture does not shout. It speaks quietly, with tremendous confidence, from inside the rock itself. The most famous structure in Petra is not technically a temple or a palace, though it looks like both. It is a tomb. The Nabataeans called it Al-Kazne. We call it the Treasury, a name given to it by later Bedouin inhabitants of the canyon who believed the urn carved at its top contained hidden treasure. It does not, but the name stuck, the way names do when stories are more compelling than facts. The treasury stands at the end of the Seek, the long narrow canyon that serves as the main entrance to Petra. The approach through the Seek is itself an experience of slow revelation. You walk between walls of sandstone that close in overhead, sometimes only a few meters apart, the rock folding and swirling in colors above you. The light is dim and cool even on a hot day. The sound of the outside world fades behind you. The canyon turns and twists so that you cannot see far ahead. And then, through a final narrow bend in the rock, a vertical slice of sunlight appears. And in that slice of light, framed by the dark walls of the canyon on both sides, you see it. The treasury stands about 40 meters high. Its facade is carved in 2 stories. The lower story has 6 columns, each one more than 10 meters tall, carved directly from the living rock of the cliff face. Between and above the columns, carved reliefs show mythological figures, eagles, dancing women who may be representations of a Nabataean goddess, a mounted figure. In the center of the upper story, there is a circular tholos, a rounded temple structure topped by a broken pediment and the famous urn. The entire facade is at once classical, in the sense of following Greek architectural proportions and decorative vocabulary, and completely original, because no one in the Greek world ever carved something like this directly into a cliff face. The interior of the treasury is a single large room, carved clean and smooth, with no decoration. It was a tomb, one chamber, designed to hold the body of someone important enough to command the labor of skilled craftsmen and enough time to execute one of the most elaborate architectural projects in the ancient world. Who was buried here? We do not know with certainty. Some scholars believe the treasury was built for the Nabataean king, Aretas III, who ruled in the 1st century BCE and who was deeply influenced by the Hellenistic world during his reign. Others suggest it might have been a slightly later king. The stone does not tell us. The body, if there ever was one, is long gone. But the treasury tells us something else. It tells us that by the time it was built, the Nabataeans had access to extraordinary wealth, sophisticated artistic knowledge, and the organizational capacity to execute a project of enormous complexity. This was not a people scraping by in the desert. This was a civilization at the height of its powers. The period of Petra's greatest flowering falls roughly between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. This was the era of the Nabataean Kingdom's greatest kings, the period when the city grew to its largest extent, when the carved facades multiplied across every available cliff face, when the colonnaded street was laid out along the valley floor, when temples rose and public baths were built and markets hummed with the business of 1,000 caravans. The Nabataean kings of this period had names that became famous even in distant Rome. Aretas III, who extended Nabataean influence all the way into Syria and came close to capturing Damascus. Aretas IV, who ruled for an extraordinarily long period, from around 9 BCE to 40 CE, and whose portrait on coins shows a man of evident intelligence and authority, his queen Shakilat beside him with equal prominence. The Nabataean queens were not ornamental. They appeared on coins, they had titles, they were honored in inscriptions. The society the Nabataeans built was not one in which half the population was invisible. Under Aretas IV, Petra reached its peak. The population of the city and its surrounding villages may have been as high as 30,000 people at this time, possibly more when you count the constant flow of travelers and merchants passing through. The markets of Petra would have been extraordinary places. Think of what passed through them. Frankincense from Dhofar, with its sharp, clean resin smell. Myrrh, darker and more complex in its scent. Cinnamon and pepper and ginger from the Indian coast, goods that had crossed the Arabian Sea and been unloaded at the port of Aqaba and carried up through the mountains. Silk, impossibly fine, rolled into bolts and wrapped in cloth for protection. Dyes, the deep red of lac and the brilliant purple, extracted from sea mollusks in Phoenician workshops. Wine from the vineyards of the Mediterranean coast, carried in amphorae packed into camel panniers with straw. Textiles from Egypt and Syria. Metalwork from all directions. And alongside the luxury goods, the Nabataeans themselves were producing things for trade. They made pottery, thin and delicate, and painted with extraordinarily fine vine and plant designs, sometimes so thin that holding a Nabataean bowl up to the light, you can see your fingers through it. This pottery has been found across the ancient world, from Arabia to Rome to the Black Sea. Wherever there were people who appreciated fine things, Nabataean pottery found its way. They also traded in the knowledge they possessed. The Nabataeans understood desert routes that no outsider could navigate. They knew where the water was. They knew which camel tracks were passable in summer and which flooded in winter. Hiring a Nabataean guide for a desert crossing was not a luxury, it was survival. The city they built reflected this wealth and this confidence. The great temple complex, known as Qasr al-Bint, stood at the western end of the valley, a freestanding temple built from massive blocks of stone rather than carved from the rock. Its walls still stand to a considerable height today, the only major freestanding structure in Petra that retains significant elevation. Before it, a large sacrificial altar allowed priests to perform public religious ceremonies. The temple was dedicated to the Nabataean gods, chief among them Dushara, a deity associated with the mountains and with kingship, whose symbol was a simple block of stone, a sacred presence in the landscape itself. Alongside Dushara, the Nabataeans venerated Al-Uzza, a goddess associated with Venus and with water, who appeared in carved reliefs across the city, and the goddess Al-Lat, associated with the sun. The Nabataean religious world was complex and syncretic, absorbing elements from the Greek, Arabian, and Egyptian traditions, while maintaining its own character. When the Greeks came to Petra, they recognized Dushara as a form of Zeus. They recognized Al-Uzza as a form of Aphrodite. Whether the Nabataeans agreed with these identifications is another matter, but the identifications made trade and diplomacy easier, which was always the Nabataean priority. On the heights above the valley floor, accessible by paths carved into the rock, the Nabataeans built their high places. Platforms cut flat into the top of the highest ridges, with carved channels to drain sacrificial blood, with carved basins for ritual washing, with views across the entire city and the surrounding desert. Standing on these heights, you understand why the Nabataeans built them. The view from the high place of sacrifice in Petra, looking out across the Red Valley with its carved facades, and its markets and its smoke rising from cooking fires, with the desert stretching to every horizon, is a view of the whole world as the Nabataeans knew it. It makes you feel, even now, that you are standing at the center of things. The relationship between Petra and Rome is one of the most important and complicated stories in the city's history. It is a story of mutual interest, diplomatic tension, gradual absorption, and eventually the transformation of an independent kingdom into a Roman province. Rome became interested in the Nabataean Kingdom for reasons that should be familiar to anyone who has followed the logic of ancient empires. The Nabataeans controlled trade. They were wealthy. They sat between Rome's Egyptian territories and the rest of the East, and they were, for most of their history, aggressively neutral, dealing with whatever power happened to be dominant in the region without fully submitting to any of them. The first major Roman contact with the Nabataean Kingdom came under the general Mark Antony, who sent an expedition against Petra in 31 BCE. The expedition accomplished little. The Nabataeans paid tribute, but were not conquered. They were too useful, as independent middlemen, to be worth the trouble of a full military campaign in the desert. The relationship continued through the early imperial period. Roman merchants travelled to Petra, Nabataean merchants travelled to Rome. The pottery of Petra appeared in Roman towns from Britain to Egypt. Roman ideas flowed back into Petra, showing up in architecture, in the layout of public spaces, in the adoption of certain Roman building techniques. The Nabataeans were, as always, absorbing what was useful and making it their own. But Rome was not a patient partner. Over the course of the 1st century CE, Roman power in the east was growing and consolidating. Egypt was firmly Roman. Syria was Roman. The Nabataean Kingdom sat between them, a wealthy and increasingly surrounded island of independence. And when the last Nabataean king, a man named Rabel II, died in 106 CE, Rome moved. The Roman annexation of the Nabataean Kingdom was accomplished without significant military resistance. There was no dramatic last stand, no siege of Petra, no fire in the temples. The kingdom simply became a Roman province, renamed Arabia Petraea, Arabia of Petra, with Petra as its capital. Roman administrators arrived. Roman legions garrisoned the frontier. The Roman road-building program began to push highways through the desert, where camel tracks had served before. And the city of Petra continued, for a while, to be Petra. The Romans built their own things in the city. A colonnaded street replaced the earlier market area along the valley floor, lined with columns and shops and public buildings in the Roman style. A public bath complex was built. A nymphaeum, an ornamental fountain fed by the city's water system, was constructed where the Seek opened into the valley. A large theatre, carved into a hillside of the rock, was expanded. The Romans loved theatre. They carved the seats directly into the stone, tiers rising up the hillside, with a capacity for perhaps 3,000 spectators. The theatre may have been started by the Nabataeans themselves and completed by the Romans. The stone does not record the transition clearly. The great temple complex, known today as the Winged Lion's Temple, may also have been modified or expanded during the Roman period. Craftsmen from different traditions working alongside each other, in a city where layers of different cultures were already visible in every surface, would have blurred the lines between what was Nabataean and what was Roman in ways that are sometimes impossible to separate today. For a generation or two after annexation, Petra continued to function as a significant city. The trade continued, the caravans still came, the markets still operated, but something had changed in the larger world that would eventually prove fatal to Petra's prosperity. The death of Petra was not dramatic. That is perhaps the most haunting thing about it. Cities usually end badly, at least in the stories we tell. They are sacked and burned. They are defeated in famous battles. They are destroyed by natural disaster. Their inhabitants are enslaved or killed. These are the endings that get recorded, that become the material of history, that leave traces in the archaeological record you can point to and say, here is where it ended. Petra's ending was not like that. It was more like a slow exhalation, like a fire that runs out of fuel not because someone puts it out, but because there is simply nothing left to burn. The central fact of Petra's decline is geography, or rather, a change in how the ancient world related to geography. The trade routes that had made Petra wealthy depended on a particular configuration of the ancient world. The goods of Arabia and India travelled overland, through the desert, to ports on the Mediterranean coast. This route was long and difficult and expensive, but it was reliable, and the Nabataeans had made themselves indispensable to it. But as the Roman imperial period progressed, the maritime trade routes became increasingly dominant. Ships could carry more cargo than camels. They travelled faster over long distances. The sea route from the Indian Ocean ports, around the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, through the Red Sea, and up to the Egyptian port of Alexandria, was dangerous, but it was increasingly navigable as navigation techniques improved. By the time of the early Roman Empire, the direct sea trade between Egypt and India was booming, and the goods that had once travelled overland through Petra were increasingly arriving directly in Alexandria by ship. This did not happen overnight. It was a gradual shift, measured in decades, not years. But each decade that passed saw a few more caravans choosing the sea route, a few more merchants finding that they could get their goods to Rome without stopping at Petra. The city did not collapse. Its markets did not empty overnight. But the constant flow of wealth, that had sustained the extraordinary building programs of the Nabataean kings began to thin. Then, in 363 CE, an earthquake struck. It was a major seismic event that damaged Petra significantly. The colonnaded street was partly destroyed. Several buildings collapsed. The water system, that marvel of Nabataean engineering, was damaged in ways that were difficult and expensive to repair. Petra was repaired, partially, imperfectly, but the city that emerged from the earthquake was smaller and less prosperous than the one that had entered it. The late Roman and early Byzantine periods saw Petra continue to function as a regional administrative and religious center. A Byzantine church was built on the ruins of an older Nabataean building. Its floors were covered in beautiful mosaics, showing personifications of the seasons and of the ocean and of figures from classical mythology. These mosaics, discovered and excavated in the 1990s, are one of the most beautiful things to come out of the Petra archaeological site. They speak of a community that still had resources, still had connections to the wider world, still valued beauty enough to commission hundreds of square meters of intricate tile work for a church floor. But they also speak of a community that was contracting. The area covered by occupied buildings in Petra during the Byzantine period is significantly smaller than it had been during the Nabataean peak. The population was declining. The trade that had once flowed through the city was flowing elsewhere. Another major earthquake struck in 551 CE. This one was worse than the one in 363. It caused extensive damage across the entire region, and Petra, already weakened, suffered badly. The water system, already partially compromised, was further damaged. Buildings that had already been weakened by the first earthquake came down in the second. The population that had been declining now declined further. And then, in the 7th century, the Islamic conquests swept through the region. The transfer of political authority was relatively peaceful in this area. The new rulers were interested in the same trade routes that had always made the region valuable. For a while, Petra continued as a small town. There is evidence of occupation in Petra during the early Islamic period, clusters of buildings in the valley, activity at the market area. But the city was contracting with each generation. The remaining population was concentrated in a smaller and smaller area of the once vast urban landscape. The magnificent carved facades along the cliff walls were now just the background scenery of a modest village. The great temple complexes were ruins. The theatre was abandoned. By the time the Crusaders arrived in the 12th century and built a small fort in the ruins of one of the ancient Nabataean buildings on a high ridge above the valley, Petra was barely a memory of itself. The Crusader presence itself was brief. Their fort, called Huayra, was abandoned after a few decades, and then even that thin thread of habitation began to fray. By the 13th or 14th century, at the latest, the last permanent inhabitants had left the Petra Valley. The carved facades remained. The rock remained. The extraordinary water channels and cisterns remained. Slowly silting up and becoming invisible, the desert returned to what it had been before the Nabataeans arrived. Almost, there were people in the surrounding landscape. The Bedouin of the region, the Badul tribe in particular, knew the valley and used it for shelter and grazing and as a source of water when the ancient cisterns were cleaned out and refilled with seasonal rain. Their knowledge of the site never fully disappeared. But to the wider world, to the scholars and travelers and merchants and diplomats of the medieval and early modern periods, Petra might as well have not existed. The maps were blank where Petra should have been. For roughly 5 centuries, the city, carved into the cliff, was known only to the people who lived in the desert around it. The rediscovery of Petra by the Western world happened on the 22nd of August 1812. The date is recorded precisely because the man who achieved it was meticulous about recording things. His name was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. He was a Swiss explorer, born in 1784, who had developed a passion for the Middle East and had spent years preparing to travel through it. He learned Arabic, he studied Islam, he dressed as a local merchant and traveled under the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, a disguise he maintained so convincingly that he spent years traveling through the Arab world without being identified as a European. Burckhardt had heard rumors from conversations with merchants and Bedouin guides, of ancient ruins in the desert mountains of the region the Arabs called Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses. The locals said there were old temples there, tombs carved into cliffs. He wanted to see them, but the region was not welcoming to outsiders. The Bedouin who lived in and around the valley were not hostile, but they were cautious of strangers who showed too much interest in the ruins. Too much interest could mean too much attention, and too much attention could mean trouble. Burckhardt devised a stratagem. He told his guide that he wanted to reach the tomb of the prophet Aaron, Harun in Arabic, which was located on the highest peak above the Petra Valley and was a place of pilgrimage. He said he had made a vow to sacrifice a goat there. This was a plausible story for a pious Muslim traveler. The guide agreed to lead him. The path to Aaron's tomb required passage through the sick. Burckhardt entered the canyon. He walked through the narrow, twisting passage, the rock walls rising high above him on both sides. He wrote afterward that the canyon was unlike anything he had ever seen. The colors of the rock, the silence, the sense of being inside the earth rather than on its surface. And then he turned the final corner and saw the treasury. He could not stop and stare, not without arousing the suspicion of his guide. He kept walking. He glanced. He noted what he saw with the practiced discretion of an experienced traveler, but he wrote about it afterward with barely contained astonishment. He described a facade of extraordinary beauty, carved from the living rock, of a scale he would not have thought possible. He described the colors of the stone. He described the silence of the place. He did not linger. He performed his religious observance at Aaron's tomb, sacrificed the goat he had brought for the purpose, and left the valley before nightfall. But he had seen what he had come to see. He had confirmed that the city the ancient world called Petra was not merely a legend. Burckhardt died in Cairo in 1817 at the age of 32 before he could return to Petra. He died of dysentery, a disease as common and as deadly as any ancient enemy. He never published a full account of Petra, but his notes survived, and they were published posthumously, and they set in motion one of the great chapters of modern archaeological exploration. Within 20 years of Burckhardt's visit, other Western travelers had made the journey to Petra. They came with sketchbooks. They came with measuring tapes. They came with the particular passion of the 19th century for the ancient world, a passion that was partly genuine scholarly curiosity and partly the desire to possess ancient things, to bring them back to Europe and display them in museums and private collections. In 1828, two French artists named Léon de Laborde and Linon de Belfons made the journey and produced detailed drawings of the facades that were published in Paris to enormous public interest. The images spread across Europe. People who had never heard of Petra now knew what its treasury looked like. They knew the general shape of the canyon. They knew that somewhere in the desert of what was then part of the Ottoman Empire, there was a city carved into a cliff that the modern world had forgotten. In 1839, the Scottish poet John William Burgon wrote an ode about Petra that contained the line that has defined the city's image ever since: a rose-red city, half as old as time. The phrase was technically inaccurate. Petra was not half as old as time by any calculation, and the poet had never actually visited the city when he wrote those words. But the phrase caught something true about the way Petra felt to those who saw it: the redness of the stone, the sense of age, the feeling that the city existed in a different relationship to time than the world you had come from. The 19th century brought scholars and artists and adventurers to Petra in increasing numbers. The Ottoman authorities, who nominally controlled the region, were not always enthusiastic about Western travelers wandering through their territory and documenting and occasionally removing ancient things. The Bedouin, for their part, initially viewed the increasing stream of European visitors with a mixture of hospitality and calculation. They were the people who knew the valley. They were the guides. They controlled access. For a long time, visiting Petra without Bedouin assistance was essentially impossible, and the Bedouin understood this and used it. The first serious archaeological work at Petra began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Teams from Britain and Germany and the United States worked at various parts of the site, recording facades, excavating parts of the valley floor, trying to understand the sequence of occupation at the site. But these early projects were limited in scope and in methodology by the standards of their time. The emphasis was often on finding objects, on recovering the portable material culture of the past. The broader story of how the city had functioned, how it had been organized, what daily life had looked like within its walls, remained largely obscure. The real revolution in Petra archaeology came in the second half of the 20th century and has continued into the present. Beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, more systematic surveys of the entire site began to document not just the famous monuments, but the entire extent of the ancient city. The results were startling. Petra was much larger than even its most enthusiastic earlier admirers had appreciated. The area enclosed by the ancient city's natural and built boundaries covers roughly 3 square kilometers of valley floor, but the Nabataean occupation extended far beyond that. Scattered across the surrounding ridges and plateaus were dozens of smaller sites, farmsteads and agricultural terraces cut into the hillsides, caravanserais along the approach roads, small sanctuaries and shrines on prominent peaks, burial grounds extending for kilometers along the cliff faces surrounding the central valley. The city, you could see from the valley floor, was only the most visible part of a much larger system of human habitation and economic activity. The agricultural terraces are particularly striking because they contradict the image of Petra as purely a trading city. The Nabataeans did trade. They traded in enormous volumes across vast distances, but they also farmed, and they farmed in a desert, and they made it work. The terraces, built into the steep hillsides surrounding the valley, captured thin soils that would otherwise have washed away in the rare but intense rains. The terrace walls held the soil in place, allowing crops to be grown on slopes that were otherwise too steep for agriculture. The cisterns and channels that collected water also served to irrigate these terraces during the dry season. The Nabataeans did not choose between trading and farming. They did both, because desert survival required flexibility and redundancy. The more archaeologists excavated and surveyed at Petra, the more the city revealed itself as a sophisticated urban environment with all the complexity that implies. There were residential neighborhoods, areas where ordinary people lived in houses built from the local stone. There were workshops where craftsmen made pottery and metalwork and glass. There were storage facilities for the goods that passed through the city's markets. There were elite residential areas where wealthy families lived in houses whose walls were painted in elaborate fresco programs. There were public spaces, squares, and colonnaded streets where the social life of the city played out. And there were the sacred spaces, the temples and high places and tomb facades, which in the Nabataean understanding of the world were not entirely separate from the rest of the city but interpenetrated it. One of the most significant recent discoveries at Petra came from an entirely unexpected direction. In the 1990s, a team of archaeologists excavating in a building that had clearly gone through multiple phases of occupation made a discovery that had nothing to do with stones or pottery or architecture. They found a collection of papyrus documents preserved in the dry desert air that turned out to be Byzantine-era legal texts. The documents, written in Greek, were property deeds and records of financial transactions and legal agreements from the 6th century CE. They provide a remarkable window into the social and economic world of late Petra, a world of families negotiating property boundaries, of disputes over water rights, of marriages and inheritances and business partnerships. These documents tell us that Petra, in the 6th century, was still a functioning community, still a place where people were investing in property and making long-term plans, even as the broader archaeological evidence suggests that the city was contracting and declining. People rarely know they are living in the last decades of something. They go to market, they make deals, they plant fields, they marry their children. The end, when it comes, usually comes not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet accumulation of small absences. There are over 800 tombs carved into the cliff faces of Petra and its surrounding ridges. This number alone tells you something important about the priorities of the Nabataean culture. They invested more effort, more artistry, more wealth in their tombs than in almost anything else. The living city has largely vanished into rubble. The dead city, carved into solid rock, is what remains. The tombs range from simple niches cut into the cliff to receive a single body, to elaborate multi-story facades that rival the treasury in their complexity and beauty. They are organized into groups along the cliff faces, the grandest usually at the most prominent positions, the simpler ones clustered around them. Scholars have organized them into typological sequences that reflect the development of Nabataean architectural style over time, from the earliest simple facades to the elaborate Hellenizing forms of the peak period to the later Roman-influenced designs. But classifying them misses something important about what they actually are. They are the homes of the dead, in a culture that took the afterlife seriously enough to commission extraordinary works of art to mark its threshold. The Nabataeans did not write extensively about their beliefs regarding death and what followed it. The inscriptions on tomb facades are remarkably restrained. They give the name of the deceased, sometimes their family relationships, sometimes a curse against anyone who disturbs the tomb or uses it for purposes other than legitimate burial. What they do not give is a theology, a description of what the Nabataeans believed happened to you after you died, what you needed for the journey, what the gods expected of you. We can infer some things. The care given to tomb construction suggests that the dead were believed to have ongoing needs, or at least ongoing honor. Many of the larger tombs have a triclinium, a dining room, associated with them, sometimes carved into the same facade or nearby in the same cliff face. These dining rooms were used for funerary feasts, occasions when the living gathered to eat and drink in the presence of their dead relatives. The boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead was permeable in the Nabataean understanding, or at least in their practice. The Nabataean gods themselves were intertwined with the landscape in ways that made sharp separations difficult. Dushara, the chief god, was associated with the mountains. His sacred image was an uncarved block of stone, a presence in the rock itself. Al-Uzza was associated with springs and with the morning star. The sacred landscape of Petra, with its carved faces and its springs and its high places on the peaks, was not separate from the divine world. It was the divine world made visible. The dead, buried in the cliff faces, were placed inside the sacred landscape rather than removed from it. Among the most beautiful and least visited of Petra's monuments is a complex known as the Garden Tomb, or sometimes the Roman Soldier Tomb, a group of 3 facades arranged around a small courtyard carved into the cliff, with a triclinium opposite the tombs. The triclinium here retains painted plaster on its interior walls, faded now, but still showing the patterns of colour that once decorated it. Sitting in that triclinium, which is open to the sky above its carved facade, you can understand the experience of the funerary feast in a way that no amount of reading about it can fully convey. The carved facade of the tomb is visible through the doorway. The dead are right there. The meal is in their honor. The stone is witness to everything. The physical experience of Petra is inseparable from its history, and it is worth spending some time on what it is actually like to be there. The Sikh entrance is genuinely disorienting. You walk into a crack in the earth and the world above you narrows until it is only a thread of sky. The walls of the canyon are not uniform. They are layered and folded in their colors, and they are carved in places by the slow work of water, and they are hung with votive niches where small carved figures once stood. The Nabataeans cut these niches into the canyon walls at intervals along the approach, placing images of their gods in the gateway passage so that travelers entering the city passed under divine protection. Some of the niches are still clearly visible. Others have been worn smooth by centuries of water and wind. The sound in the Sikh is interesting. The narrow walls focus sound in unexpected ways. Your own footsteps come back to you from the rock. Voices carry strangely. On busy days with many visitors, the canyon fills with a murmur that echoes and re-echoes until it loses its human origin and becomes something more ambient, more geological. On quieter days, early in the morning or late in the afternoon, the Sikh is close to silent. You hear the wind moving through the canyon. You hear the occasional drip of water from the carved channel along one wall. You hear the sound of your own breathing. When the treasury appears at the end of the Sikh, the scale of it is difficult to process for a moment. The photographs that are most often used to represent Petra are taken from inside the Sikh, framing the treasury at the end of the narrow gap in the rock so that the facade appears to float in a rectangle of light. The photograph is accurate in what it shows, but misleading in what it conveys. Because photographs have no scale, when you actually stand at the mouth of the Sikh and look at the treasury, you need a moment to understand how tall those columns are. You need to look for a person standing at its base to orient yourself, and when you find one, they are very small, and the columns are not. The rest of the city spreads out from the treasury into a wide valley that opens up after the constriction of the Sikh. The theatre is to the left, its tiers of stone seats rising up the hillside, looking across the valley toward the cliff faces opposite, where hundreds of tomb facades are carved at various heights. The colonnaded street runs straight through the valley, its fallen columns partially re-erected in modern times, leading toward the temple complex at the far end. On either side of the street, the ruins of shops and public buildings and private houses extend back toward the cliffs. The facades multiply as you walk. They are everywhere. They are carved at every scale, from tiny niches barely large enough to hold a single urn to enormous multi-story structures. The most impressive concentration of facades, known as the royal tombs, lines the eastern cliff face of the valley in a series of enormous, elaborate structures that dominate the view from the valley floor. The urn tomb, the silk tomb, the Corinthian tomb, the palace tomb, each one massive, each one distinct, each one carved from the same living rock that forms the cliff itself, so that the facades seem to grow from the stone rather than having been imposed on it. The climb up to the monastery, the largest facade in Petra and perhaps the most remote from the main tourist path, takes about 40 minutes on foot, up a staircase carved into the rock. The staircase is ancient. The Nabataeans carved it. It is worn smooth and slightly rounded by the feet of 2,000 years of pilgrims and visitors and residents. At the top, the monastery appears suddenly around a corner, as the treasury appears at the end of the Sikh. But the monastery has a different character from the treasury. It is larger, for one thing, its facade reaching perhaps 45 meters high. It is simpler in its ornamentation, less cluttered with carved figures, and it faces a broad, open space, a natural plateau in front of the cliff that offers a view across the surrounding mountains that seems to extend to the edge of the world. The monastery was probably built as a tomb and later used as a Christian church, as the crosses carved into its interior walls suggest. But sitting in front of it, in the late afternoon, when the light comes from the west and the stone of the facade glows in warm colors, you are not primarily thinking about its function. You are thinking about what it means that human beings, living in a desert, using tools of iron and bronze and will, made this. What sustained them in the effort, what they believed they were honoring in the making of it. The Bedouin, who lived inside Petra until the 1980s, have a history with the site that is both intimate and complicated. They are descendants of the Bedouin tribes who have inhabited the region for centuries, and their ancestral connection to the valley predates modern archaeology and modern tourism and modern borders. They built their homes in the ancient carved rooms and chambers of the Nabataean city, patching the doorways with stones and brush, cooking in spaces that had once been funerary dining rooms, keeping their animals in chambers that had once been sacred to gods whose names they had never heard. Their knowledge of Petra was, in many ways, more complete than that of any scholar. They knew every path, every cistern, every cave. They knew which chambers could be kept warm in winter and which ones flooded when the rains came. They knew the water sources that the archaeologists were still mapping on paper. They could navigate the canyon system in the dark, by memory and by feel, the way people who have lived somewhere their whole lives can navigate it. In the 1980s, when the Jordanian government began to develop Petra as a major tourist destination, the Bedouin were relocated out of the valley to a purpose-built village called Sehun on the plateau above. The relocation was controversial. The Bedouin were given houses with electricity and running water. They were given schools for their children, but they were also removed from the landscape that had defined their lives and the lives of their ancestors for generations. Many Bedouin continue to work in and around the Petra site today as guides and vendors and camel handlers, but they no longer live there. The story of the Bedouin and Petra is a version of a story that repeats itself around archaeological sites all over the world. The tension between the preservation of the past and the lives of the people who have made the past's location their present. There are no clean answers to this tension. The Nabataean past of Petra is important and worth preserving. The living culture of the Budul is also important and worth preserving. These two things are not always compatible, and the choices made in the service of one often come at the cost of the other. Water remains the key to understanding Petra in a way that is not immediately obvious to a visitor walking through the site on a pleasant day. The water system that the Nabataeans built was not a convenience. It was the precondition for everything else. The basic problem was simple. The Petra Valley received its water from two sources: a spring called Ain Musa, the Spring of Moses, which emerged from the hillside some distance to the east of the Sikh and flowed through or near the canyon as a small stream, and occasional rainfall, which fell mostly in the winter months and, when it fell, could fall with enough intensity to send violent flash floods roaring through the canyon system. The spring was reliable but limited. The rainwater was abundant in the sense of total volume over a season, but almost entirely useless without a way to capture and store it, because it mostly ran off the rocky slopes and out into the desert within hours of falling. The Nabataean solution was a system of extraordinary complexity and elegance. They carved channels into the rock faces of the canyon walls to intercept water flowing down the slopes and redirect it towards cisterns. They built ceramic pipe systems, the pipes fired in kilns and fitted together with ceramic collars and waterproofed with plaster, to carry spring water along the walls of the Sikh and through the city. They carved hundreds of cisterns of varying sizes throughout the city and in the surrounding ridges, each one positioned to receive water from the channels above it. They built dams across the side wadis to capture flash flood water and allow it to filter slowly into the ground or into additional cisterns. The ceramic pipe system that ran through the Sikh to bring water into the city is one of the most remarkable pieces of engineering in the Nabataean achievement. The pipes were fitted along both walls of the canyon, one carrying water from the spring, one serving as a drainage channel. They had to be installed into rock that was sometimes vertical, sometimes overhanging, across a passage that wound and twisted for about 1.5 kilometers. The installation would have required sustained engineering knowledge and physical labor of considerable difficulty. And it worked, reliably, for centuries. The total storage capacity of the Petra water system has been estimated by modern hydrologists at something close to 40 million litres. That is enough to supply a population of several tens of thousands for an extended period without any additional rainfall. The system was not perfect. It required constant maintenance. Channels silted up and had to be cleaned. Cistern walls cracked and had to be replastered. Pipes broke and had to be repaired. But a city that invested the resources to maintain it had a reliable water supply in a desert environment where water scarcity would otherwise have been a permanent constraint on growth. When the water system was damaged by the 363 CE earthquake, the loss was not just infrastructural, it was existential. The cisterns began to silt up without the channels to keep them filled and cleaned. The pipe system, broken in multiple places, could not deliver the spring water to the city. The population that depended on this water had to find water elsewhere, which meant moving elsewhere. The water was the city in a very real sense, and without the water, the city could not persist. The faith traditions that passed through Petra leave their marks on the stone in ways that are sometimes clear and sometimes ambiguous. The Nabataean religious tradition was, as we have noted, syncretic and visually complex. Their sacred images included the carved block of stone representing Dushara, elaborate carved niches representing other deities, and the carved facades of the tombs themselves, which served both as monuments to the dead and as places of ongoing religious observance. The Nabataean sacred landscape was not a series of separate sacred sites. It was the entire valley, every cliff face and high place and spring and doorway in the stone. When Nabataean religion encountered the religious traditions of the broader ancient world, the encounters were generally accommodating rather than confrontational. The Greek and Roman identifications of Nabataean deities with their own gods were accepted, or at least tolerated, because they facilitated the trade relationships that were the foundation of Nabataean prosperity. A Nabataean merchant in Alexandria could participate in a religious ceremony honoring Aphrodite without feeling that he was betraying Dushara, because Aphrodite and Al-Uzza were, in this cosmopolitan understanding of the divine world, the same thing seen from different angles. Christianity arrived in the region during the first centuries of the Common Era, spreading through the trade networks that connected Petra to the broader Mediterranean world. By the 4th century, when the Roman Empire was adopting Christianity as its official religion, Petra had a Christian community significant enough to have a bishop. The seat of the Bishop of Petra is attested in the records of early church councils. The Bishop of Petra sat alongside the bishops of other cities in the region, the spiritual representatives of a still living urban community. The church building, whose mosaic floor was discovered in the 1990s, was probably built in the 5th or 6th century during the Byzantine period. It was a substantial building, large enough to have been a significant gathering place for the Christian community of Petra. The mosaics that covered its floor were not cheap or hasty work. They were the product of skilled craftsmen working with fine materials, commissioned by a community that valued beauty in its sacred spaces and had the resources to pay for it. After the Islamic conquests of the 7th century, the Christian community of Petra gradually faded, absorbed into the new religious landscape of the region. There is some evidence of continued Christian presence in Petra into the early Islamic period, but it was increasingly marginal. The mosque that would have served the Muslim community of Petra during the early Islamic period has not been conclusively identified archaeologically, which may reflect the declining population of the city rather than an absence of Islamic presence. The crosses carved into the interior walls of the monastery speak to a long period during which that space was used by the Christian community as a place of worship. Whether the carvers were local converts or traveling pilgrims, or some combination, is unknown. The crosses are simple, without elaboration, the marks of people affirming their faith in a space that had already, by then, accumulated many centuries of sacred meaning. The landscape of Petra is not static. It never has been. The sandstone cliffs are being slowly shaped by the same forces that created them. Wind carries abrasive particles against the rock faces, slowly rounding edges that were once sharp. Rain, when it comes, carries water into cracks, and through repeated cycles of wetting and drying, slowly expands those cracks. Temperature changes between day and night cause the rock to expand and contract, contributing to long-term weathering. The geological process that formed the Red Mountains of the Petra region over millions of years is still operating on a timescale that makes human civilizations look like brief incidents in the rock. The tourism that Petra receives, which peaked in the years before the COVID pandemic at something close to 1 million visitors annually, is itself a form of pressure on the site. Footsteps vibrate floors and walls. Moisture from human breath accumulates in enclosed spaces. The repeated passage of visitors along the paths through the valley and the seek polishes the stone surfaces, and in some places accelerates erosion. The management of visitor impact at Petra is a constant and complex challenge for the Jordanian government and the archaeologists and conservators who work there. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty. The rare but intense rainstorms that the Petra region experiences are becoming, in some models, less predictable in their timing and more extreme in their intensity when they do occur. A flash flood in the Seek, which has happened several times in the modern period and killed tourists on at least one occasion, is one of the more dramatic manifestations of this. But the longer-term effects of changing rainfall patterns on the ancient water management infrastructure, much of which still exists in some form, are harder to predict and potentially more significant. The work of preserving Petra is ongoing and multifaceted. The Petra Archaeological Park, administered by the Jordanian government through the Petra Development and Tourism Region Authority, manages the site in coordination with international archaeological teams and conservation organizations. There are active excavation projects at several locations within the site, revealing new aspects of the ancient city's organization and daily life. There are conservation projects stabilizing vulnerable facades and buildings. There are survey projects documenting every aspect of the ancient landscape to create records that will survive even if the physical remains do not. Jordan has invested significantly in Petra because the site is central to the country's identity and its tourist economy. Petra appears on Jordanian currency. It is the image most associated with the country in international media. When the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was shot partly at the Treasury in 1988, it introduced Petra to a global audience that had never heard of the Nabataeans. The number of visitors to the site increased dramatically in the years following the film's release, and it has never returned to pre-film levels. The relationship between Petra and popular culture is itself a kind of continuation of the story that began in the 19th century with Burckhardt and de Laborde and Burgon. Each generation discovers Petra afresh and is astonished by it. Each generation adds new layers of meaning and association to a place that already carries thousands of years of human meaning. The treasury that Indiana Jones ran through on his way to find the Holy Grail is the same treasury that Burckhardt glimpsed through the canyon in 1812, and the same structure that a Nabataean craftsman spent years carving from the cliff face 2,000 years ago. The stone holds all of these encounters simultaneously, as stone does, without preference or judgment. There is a mountain above Petra, the highest point in the surrounding landscape, where a small white-domed tomb sits on a rocky summit. This is traditionally the tomb of the prophet Harun ibn Imran, the brother of Moses, the first high priest of the Hebrew tradition. The Muslim tradition accepts the association of this peak with Aaron, and the tomb on its summit has been a place of pilgrimage for Muslim travelers through the region for many centuries. It was to this tomb that Burckhardt was ostensibly heading when he entered the Sikh and discovered the treasury. Whether Aaron is actually buried on this peak is unknown and unknowable, but the association of this landscape with Moses and Aaron is not random. The region of Petra appears in the Hebrew Bible as part of the wilderness through which the Israelites wandered on their journey from Egypt to Canaan. The spring of Moses, Ain Musa, takes its name from the tradition that Moses struck the rock here and water flowed out, the same miracle described in the Book of Numbers. Whether this particular spring is the one referred to in the text is a matter of faith rather than archaeology, but the landscape around Petra, the red desert, the hidden valley, the springs emerging from apparently dry rock, is the kind of landscape in which such stories take root and persist. The Nabataeans themselves had traditions about the ancient sacred significance of their valley. Dushara, whose name means roughly "he of the Shara Mountains," was a deity inseparable from this specific landscape. The Shara Mountains are the mountains in which Petra is located. The god was not a deity who might be moved to another city and worshipped there in the same way. He was a deity of this place, this rock, these mountains. The worship of Dushara was, in a profound sense, the worship of the landscape itself. This rootedness of the divine in the landscape may be one of the reasons the Nabataeans invested so much labor in carving into the rock rather than building on its surface. When you carve into the rock, you are not imposing a human structure on the landscape. You are finding a human space inside the landscape. You are uncovering what was always there, potentially, in the stone. The facades of Petra do not feel like additions to the cliff faces. They feel like the cliff faces finally expressing what was always inside them. Imagine waking up in Petra in the 2nd century CE, in the reign of Aretas IV, at the city's peak. The first thing you would notice is the light. The sandstone cliffs catch the first sun while the valley floor is still in shadow, and the high facades on the eastern cliff glow red and gold before the sun has properly risen. The air is cool. The desert loses its heat quickly at night, and the mornings in the valley, sheltered from the wind by the surrounding cliffs, have a clarity that belongs to the desert alone. The sounds of the city would start before the light. Animals first. The camels in the caravan grounds near the southern entrance to the city, their particular grumbling vocalization carrying easily in the still morning air. Donkeys, dogs, the distant sound of water moving in the channels along the cliff walls, a constant quiet accompaniment to everything in Petra, the city's steady pulse. Then, the human sounds. The clatter of cooking in the workshops and houses along the colonnaded street, where vendors were setting up their stalls and fires were being lit for the morning bread. The voices of the temple priests beginning their morning rituals in the temple precincts on the west side of the valley. The calls of caravan masters, organizing the departure of a group that had arrived the night before and was preparing to move on with its load of incense and spices and dye. The market would fill as the sun rose and the valley warmed. Merchants from a dozen different cultures would be present. Speakers of Nabataean, of Greek, of Latin, of Aramaic, of Himyaritic from southern Arabia, of the various languages of the Indian Ocean trade world. A shared trading vocabulary would have developed across these languages, as it always does when commercial necessity demands it. You could buy almost anything in Petra's market, or rather, you could commission anything. A Nabataean potter could show you samples of the fine painted ware that had made the city's pottery famous. A bronze worker could show you lamps and vessels and mirrors. A cloth merchant could spread out samples of the textiles available, from local woven goods to imported silk from the east. The smells of the market would have been intense. The sweet, resinous smell of frankincense, which was burned in vast quantities in the temples and also sold by weight in the market stalls. The sharper, earthier smell of myrrh, the pungent warmth of pepper and cinnamon and ginger from the east. The animal smell of a city with thousands of camels and donkeys within its boundaries. The smell of cooking food from the thermopolia, the fast food shops that lined the street, where hot meals were sold to travelers who had no time or means to cook for themselves. The smell of water, clean and cold, from the fountains fed by the city's pipe system, a smell that would have registered consciously to every traveler arriving in this place from the dry desert. The religious life of the city was woven through everything else, not separated into designated times and spaces. A traveler passing through the Sikh would have touched the carved niches in the canyon walls as he walked, acknowledging the deity represented there. A merchant completing a successful sale would have burned a pinch of incense at the small shrine in the corner of his stall. The priests of the great temple performed their rituals with the efficiency of professionals whose function was to maintain the relationship between the city and its gods, a relationship on which the city's continued prosperity depended. The dead were everywhere, in the most literal sense. The tomb facades lined the cliffs all around the valley. The triclinia, cut into the same cliff faces, marked the places where families came to eat with their dead. The relationship between the living and the dead in Petra was not one of separation. The dead had their quarters in the cliff walls. The living walked and worked and traded below. Both were present in the same valley, sharing the same red stone, participating in the same continuous life of the city. And over all of it, the mountain watched. The high peaks above the valley, with their carved high places and their views across the desert to every horizon, gave the whole human scene below its scale. The people in the market were small, against the stone. The carved facades on the cliffs were remarkable, but the cliffs themselves were more remarkable still. Petra was a city that never let you forget you were inside the earth, inside something much larger than yourself. That quality, that particular combination of human achievement and geological humility, is still there when you visit today. The market is gone, the caravans are gone, the priests and the merchants and the craftsmen and the caravan masters are all gone. But the stone remains, and the light remains, and the feeling that you are inside something much larger than yourself remains, as it was always going to. The afterlife of Petra in the scholarly imagination has produced some remarkable work. The study of the Nabataean script, for example, has its own fascinating history. The Nabataeans wrote in a form of Aramaic script that was modified and adapted over time in ways that make it quite different from the Aramaic of other ancient traditions. And one of the most significant facts about the Nabataean script is that it is the ancestor of the Arabic script used today across the Middle East and beyond. The Arabic alphabet, with its flowing connected letters and its 28 consonants and its system of vowel marking, developed from the Nabataean Aramaic script through a process of gradual evolution over the centuries between the decline of the Nabataean Kingdom and the rise of Islam. The earliest forms of the Arabic script that are clearly recognizable are found in inscriptions from the northern Hejaz region of Arabia, the area adjacent to Nabataean territory, and they show the characteristic features of Nabataean script at a transitional stage of their development. This means that every time Arabic is written today, everywhere in the world where Arabic speakers write their language, the shapes of the letters carry within them a faint genetic memory of the script used in Petra. The stone inscriptions on the tombs of Petra, the commercial contracts written on papyrus and pottery sherds, the graffiti scratched by Nabataean travelers on rocks across the desert, all of these are the ancestors of the Arabic writing system. The Nabataeans did not vanish without a trace. They left their letters in every word written in Arabic. The Nabataean language itself, the spoken form, was probably closely related to what we now call Old Arabic. As the Nabataean Kingdom declined and was absorbed into Roman Arabia and then into the wider world of late antiquity, the spoken Nabataean language shifted toward forms of Arabic that became the ancestor of classical and eventually modern Arabic. The Nabataeans did not disappear. They became Arabs in the linguistic and cultural sense, contributing their language and their script to the tradition that would eventually produce one of the great literary cultures of the world. There are moments in Petra, particularly at dawn and at dusk, when the light does something to the stone that is difficult to describe without seeming to exaggerate. At dawn, when the first rays of the sun come over the eastern ridge and begin to illuminate the cliff faces on the western side of the valley, the facades of the royal tombs are still in shadow. They are dark against the brightening sky, and then the light catches the top of the cliff above them, and the coloured bands in the stone start to glow. Red becomes more red, yellow becomes golden, white becomes luminous. The shadow line moves down the cliff face slowly, and as each level of carved facade emerges from shadow into light, it seems to come alive in a way that feels less like illumination and more like waking up. At dusk, the process reverses. The shadow creeps up the cliff faces from the valley floor. The carved facades are swallowed progressively from below, the upper portions remaining in golden light, while the lower portions go dark. The last things to hold the light are usually the highest pediments of the largest facades, catching the last horizontal rays of the sun after everything below them has gone into shadow. They hold the light for a few moments, burning with a colour that has no good name in English, and then the shadow reaches them too, and they go dark, and the sky above them is still blue for another few minutes before it too begins to darken. The Nabataeans were not unaware of this. The high places of sacrifice on the ridges above the valley were positioned not just for defensibility or for proximity to the sky. They were positioned to observe the movement of the sun across the landscape, to watch the light play on the valley below, to stand at a point where the sacred geography of the landscape was most fully visible. The ancient world was, in general, more attentive to the relationship between light and sacred space than we often give it credit for. The alignment of temples with solar events at particular times of year, the orientation of tomb facades to catch the light of the rising or setting sun at significant moments, the use of particular rock types that catch and hold light in specific ways. All of these were deliberate choices in cultures that understood the religious significance of light in ways that we have largely forgotten. The question of what the Nabataeans believed about beauty is interesting because it has no simple answer. Their art and architecture are beautiful, but their beauty operates differently from other ancient traditions. Greek architectural beauty is about proportion and order. The mathematical relationships between the parts of a Greek temple, the way the columns relate to the entablature relate to the overall height, the careful handling of optical effects to make straight things look straight, all of this reflects a philosophical commitment to the idea that beauty is a property of correctly ordered things. Egyptian architectural beauty is about permanence and scale. The massive stone blocks of the pyramids and temples are beautiful because they are eternal, because they resist time, because they make the human gesture of construction into something that will outlast every individual human life. Nabataean beauty is something else. It is the beauty of the found. The Nabataeans carved their facades from rock that already existed. They did not bring materials to a site and assemble them. They found the form inside the material that was already there. The colours of the stone are not additions, they are discoveries. Each facade was a collaboration between the craftsman's imagination and the particular patterns of colour and texture that the stone presented as the cutting progressed. This quality, the quality of revealing rather than imposing, of finding rather than constructing, gives Nabataean art a peculiar kind of inevitability. The treasury does not look like it was built. It looks like it was uncovered, as if it was always there, inside the cliff, waiting for someone to see it and cut away everything that was not the treasury until the treasury appeared. Whether the Nabataeans would have articulated their aesthetic philosophy in anything like these terms is impossible to say, but the evidence of what they made suggests a sensibility that was deeply responsive to the material world, to the particular qualities of specific places and specific stones and specific plays of light. They were not universalists in their aesthetics. They were particularists. What they made in Petra could only have been made in Petra, from the specific stone of Petra, in the specific light of the Jordanian desert. It does not translate. In the end, Petra teaches us something about the relationship between civilization and landscape that is worth sitting with quietly. We tend to think of civilizations as things that are built on top of landscapes. The landscape is the stage. The civilization is the production. When the production ends, the stage is cleared, and another production can begin. But Petra complicates this. The Nabataean civilization did not build on top of the landscape. It was built into the landscape, literally. The tombs are inside the rock. The water channels are cut into the cliff faces. The sacred high places are on the peaks of the mountains. The city occupies the same natural valley that geography placed there, using the shapes and forms that geology created, adding human purpose to what wind and water had already begun. When the Nabataean civilization ended, the landscape did not clear itself. The carved rooms and facades remained inside the rock because they are the rock. They cannot be demolished without demolishing the cliff. They cannot be removed without removing the mountain. And so they are still there, 2,000 years later, and they will be there for as long as the mountain stands. This is perhaps the most important thing about Petra. The Nabataeans found a way to make their civilization as permanent as the geology it was built into, not because they were trying to achieve immortality, though the investment in the tombs suggests they were thinking about permanence in some form, but because the technology they used, the technology's carving rather than building, of revealing rather than constructing, happened to be uniquely resistant to the forces that end civilizations. Wars cannot tear down what is already part of the mountain. Fire cannot burn stone. The empires that rose and fell around the Nabataean Kingdom, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the Romans and the Byzantines and the Umayyads and the Crusaders, none of them could erase what the Nabataeans had done. They could occupy the city, they could modify it, they could use it for their own purposes, but they could not unmake it. Only time and water and the slow work of wind can do that. And they are doing it, steadily, quietly, across millennia. The edges of the carved reliefs are a little less sharp than they were a century ago. The faces of the carved figures are a little less distinct than they were a century ago. The colors of the stone are subtly different as the surface weathers, but the facades are still there. The treasury is still there. The Sikh is still there. The high places are still there. Petra outlasted its civilization by a very long time, and it is still outlasting it. The stars above Petra, on a clear night away from the lights of the modern settlements, are the same stars the Nabataean caravan masters used to navigate the desert routes, the same stars the priests observed from the high places to track the sacred calendar, the same stars that travelers in the Sikh at night would have looked up at through the narrow ribbon of sky above the canyon walls. The sky is, of all the things that remain from the ancient world, the most completely unchanged. The mountains are worn by time. The stone is weathered. The channels silt up, but the stars are where they were. The constellations the Nabataeans named, and we do not know what names they gave them, are the same constellations that wheel overhead now. Orion rises in the east in the same winter months. The Milky Way arches across the same southern sky. The planet that the Nabataeans associated with their goddess Al-Uzza, the morning star that we call Venus, still rises before the sun in its seasons. There is something stabilizing about this, in the way that long, slow rhythms are always stabilizing. The city ended, the people dispersed, the caravan stopped running, the market fell silent, the water channels silted up. The great civilization of the Nabataeans became first a province, then a memory, then a legend, then a discovery, then a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by 1 million tourists a year. But the rock remained, and the stars remained, and the particular quality of the light on the stone at dawn and at dusk, the way the carved facades catch it and hold it and release it as the day progresses, that remained too. Petra is a place that asks you to think slowly. It does not reward hurry. It was not built by people who were in a hurry, and it does not reveal itself to people who are in a hurry. The stone gives up its meanings at its own pace, in its own time, in the particular light of a particular hour of a particular day. You could spend a week in Petra and feel that you had only begun to understand it. You could spend a lifetime studying it and feel the same. The rose-red city, as the poet called it, half as old as time, not quite that old, but old enough to have seen everything, old enough to have outlasted everything that threatened it, old enough to still be there, carved into the living rock of the Jordanian desert, waiting in the canyon for whoever comes next, ready to be discovered again by the next generation of people who turn the corner at the end of the sick and look up and cannot quite believe what they are seeing. That is Petra. That is the city carved into a cliff, and it is still there, tonight, in the desert, glowing faintly in the starlight, exactly as it was when the Nabataeans left it. The stone does not mourn, the stone does not celebrate, the stone simply remains, and that, perhaps, is the most extraordinary thing about it. History for Sleep, new episodes every week. Number, extended narrative, the full story of Petra's world. To understand Petra fully, you have to understand the world that made it necessary. Not just the geography of the land it sat in, but the larger logic of the ancient world's economy. The logic that made a city in a desert not just possible, but inevitable. The ancient world ran on aromatics. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal economic fact. The temples of Egypt burned frankincense in quantities that required organized, sustained, long-distance trade to supply them. The temples of Greece and Rome did the same. The burial rites of the wealthy across the entire Mediterranean world required myrrh. The medical traditions of the ancient world, from Egyptian healing temples to the pharmacy of the Greco-Roman tradition, required resins and spices that could only be obtained from specific plants in specific regions of the world, most of them far to the south or east of the Mediterranean basin. Frankincense comes from trees of the genus Boswellia, which grow in a narrow band of territory across southern Arabia, the Horn of Africa, and parts of India. The trees are unremarkable in appearance, gnarled and small-leaved, adapted to grow in rocky, almost soil-free terrain. But when their bark is cut, they bleed a resin that, when dried and burned, produces one of the most distinctive and widely valued scents in human history. The smoke of frankincense rises in a thick white column that disperses slowly in still air. The scent is clean and sharp and slightly sweet, nothing quite like anything else, immediately recognizable once you have encountered it. The ancients valued frankincense not just for its scent, but for its metaphysical properties. It was believed to be pleasing to the gods. It was burned in temples as a form of prayer made visible, the smoke carrying human petition upward toward the divine. It was used in burial rituals to purify the space around the dead and to prepare the body for whatever journey lay ahead. It was used medically, for treating infections and wounds, and as an ingredient in compound medicines. It was used in cosmetics. It was used as an ingredient in the coal eye paint that Egyptian women used in quantities enormous enough to constitute a significant trade commodity on their own. Myrrh comes from trees of the genus Commiphora, also in the southern Arabian and East African region. It has a darker, more complex scent than frankincense, slightly bitter, slightly sweet, with a depth that develops as it burns. It was used in the same contexts as frankincense, often in combination with it, and had its own specific associations in various religious traditions. The quantities of myrrh consumed across the ancient world were, by any modern reckoning, extraordinary. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, mentioned that the Arabians supplied 1,000 talents of frankincense annually to the Persian king for his temples alone. A talent was not a small unit of weight. The implication is that the production and transport of aromatics was already, in the 5th century BCE, a major industrial and commercial enterprise. By the time the Nabataeans rose to prominence, the trade in frankincense and myrrh had been organized along particular routes for centuries. The goods were harvested in the south by specialized communities who held hereditary rights to specific groves of trees. They were transported north and west by a series of middlemen, each extracting their cut of the value as the goods moved from hand to hand along the route. By the time frankincense reached the Mediterranean coast, it had passed through many hands and had accumulated enormous value. The Nabataeans were positioned precisely at a crucial node in this flow of value, and they used that position with intelligence and ruthlessness. The incense road from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean coast ran for roughly 2,000 kilometers through some of the most difficult terrain in the world. The route crossed the great sand deserts of the Rub al-Khali and the central Arabian highlands. It passed through the Hejaz, the long coastal strip along the Red Sea, climbing through mountain passes and descending into valleys. It crossed the Sinai Peninsula, and it arrived at the ports of the eastern Mediterranean coast, at Gaza and Rinocolora and Pelusium, where the goods were loaded onto ships for distribution across the sea. Along this entire route, the caravans needed water. They needed food. They needed places to shelter from the sun and the wind. They needed protection from the desert tribes that might otherwise have regarded passing caravans as opportunities for raiding. The Nabataeans, who controlled the middle and upper portions of this route through their territory, provided all of these things, and in providing them, they made themselves indispensable. A camel caravan moving at the pace of a loaded animal, about 25 to 30 kilometers per day, could take 60 or 70 days to travel from the frankincense-producing regions of southern Arabia to the ports of the Mediterranean coast. During this journey, the animals and the human beings driving them required water at least every 2 or 3 days, and in the hottest part of the summer, more frequently than that. The Nabataeans, with their extraordinary knowledge of every water source along the route and their network of built cisterns and wells, could guarantee water where no other guide could. They also guaranteed safety. The Nabataean caravan escort was not just a guide service, it was a protection service. Bands of desert raiders who might have attacked an unescorted caravan were deterred by the knowledge that Nabataean escorts were well armed, disciplined, and backed by the full force of the Nabataean military. The toll paid to the Nabataeans for crossing their territory was expensive, but it was cheaper than having your caravan raided. The Nabataean business model, understood in this context, was essentially a security and logistics premium. They charged what the market would bear for indispensable services in a sector where the alternatives were much worse. This is a model that would be familiar to any modern business person. It is also a model that only works as long as you remain indispensable. When the maritime trade routes developed to the point where the overland route through Nabataean territory became optional rather than necessary, the entire economic foundation of the Nabataean Kingdom began to erode. The relationship between the Nabataean Kingdom and the Jewish world of its era is one of the more intriguing and understudied aspects of Nabataean history. The Nabataean Kingdom bordered the Jewish political world throughout the Hasmonean and Herodian periods, and the two societies had extensive commercial and diplomatic relationships. The Nabataean king Aretas II was in contact with the Hasmonean rulers of Judea. Aretas III actually entered and briefly controlled Damascus, making the Nabataean kingdom a power player in the same regional political arena as the Jewish kingdoms. The Herodian dynasty, who ruled Judea under Roman oversight from around 37 BCE, had Nabataean blood in their family. Herod the Great's mother was a Nabataean woman named Cypros. This made Herod half Nabataean, which his enemies among the Jerusalem aristocracy never let him forget. The Apostle Paul, writing in one of his letters, mentions spending time in Arabia before beginning his ministry and then escaping from Damascus, where the ethnarch of King Aretas IV was trying to arrest him. The mention is brief and unexplained, and scholars have debated for centuries what Paul was doing in Arabia, which most likely means the Nabataean Kingdom. Whatever the reason for his stay there, the reference places Paul, one of the most important figures in the early history of Christianity, in Nabataean territory at a formative moment in his life. The Nabataean Kingdom was not indifferent to the Jewish religious world. There is evidence that some Nabataeans adopted Jewish practices or identified with aspects of Jewish religion, just as there is evidence of Jewish communities living within Nabataean territory. The ancient world was not as tidily separated into distinct religious communities as later history sometimes makes it appear. Trade brought people together. People sharing trading relationships often shared other things as well: food, stories, religious ideas. The trading community that passed through Petra over its centuries of activity would have included Jewish merchants, Christian merchants after the 1st century CE, Zoroastrian merchants from the Persian world, polytheists of a dozen different traditions. The Nabataeans dealt with all of them with the pragmatic hospitality of people who understood that trade required a certain suspension of other differences. In the market at Petra, what mattered was not what you believed about the divine, but whether your goods were genuine and your weights were honest. Let us think for a moment about the scale of what was actually carved at Petra. Not in abstract terms, but concretely. The treasury stands 40 meters high and roughly 28 meters wide. It is carved from solid sandstone, the stone that was removed to create the facade. The columns, the pediments, the decorative reliefs was not transported away. It had to go somewhere. When you carve into a cliff face, the rock that is cut away falls or is removed in pieces, and those pieces have to be moved. The volumes of stone involved in creating the treasury alone would have been enormous. Then consider that the treasury is one of the more famous facades, but not the largest. The palace tomb, one of the royal tombs on the eastern cliff, has a facade that is roughly 49 meters wide, covering an area of cliff face that makes the treasury look modest. The monastery, which we have already described, is even larger, and beyond the famous individual monuments, there are hundreds of smaller facades, chambers, niches, channels, cisterns, all requiring the removal of stone. The total volume of stone removed in the carving of Petra over its centuries of development is difficult to estimate, but it is certainly in the millions of cubic meters. Moving this material, even in the form of rubble that was simply pushed to the side or piled against the base of the cliff, would have required sustained, organized labor over extended periods. Who did this work? The Nabataean economy almost certainly included some form of coerced labor, as virtually all ancient economies did. But the Nabataeans were not known for large-scale slave owning in the way that the Roman economy was. The early Greek descriptions of Nabataean society emphasized their egalitarianism and their rejection of slaves. Whether this remained true as the kingdom grew and became more complex is difficult to know. What seems clear is that the Nabataean building programs at their peak required the coordination of large numbers of skilled workers, craftsmen who specialized in stone cutting and decoration, supervised by architects, who could plan and execute projects of enormous complexity. The craftsmen who carved the facades of Petra were not unskilled laborers. Cutting a column from the living rock of a cliff face, maintaining the correct proportions over its full height, ensuring that it aligns with the other columns at the correct spacing, all while working from scaffolding suspended on the cliff face, requires skill and experience and careful planning. The decorative reliefs, the carved figures, and architectural ornaments require different skills, again, those of the sculptor rather than the engineer. The drilling and installation of the ceramic water pipe system required different skills still. Petra was, in a real sense, a city of specialists. The complexity of what it built and maintained required the sustained presence of people with highly developed technical knowledge. Where did these people come from? Some were certainly Nabataean-born craftsmen who had learned their trades within the kingdom's tradition, but others were probably brought in from the broader ancient world. Greek sculptors and architects attracted by the Nabataean Kingdom's wealth, Egyptian craftsmen familiar with the tradition of rock-cut architecture that had been practiced in the Nile Valley for centuries, craftsmen from the Hellenistic cities of Syria who brought with them knowledge of the latest architectural fashions. Petra absorbed them all, as it absorbed everything else that came through it. And what emerged from the absorption was something that was not Greek and not Egyptian and not Hellenistic and not purely Nabataean. It was Petra. The Nabataean writing system deserves more attention than it usually receives in popular accounts of the civilization. The Nabataeans were, above all else, a literate people. Their literacy was commercial in origin. Long-distance trade requires written records. Contracts, bills of lading, receipts, letters of credit. All of these require a writing system that is efficient and portable and legible to the people who need to use it. The Nabataeans adapted the Aramaic script that was the common commercial writing system of the ancient Near East and developed it in ways that suited their particular needs. Nabataean inscriptions have been found across an enormous geographic area. There are Nabataean inscriptions in Petra, naturally, but there are also Nabataean inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula, left by Nabataean pilgrims and travelers on the rocks along the caravan routes. There are Nabataean inscriptions in the Hejaz, the region of Arabia through which the incense road passed. There are Nabataean inscriptions in Egypt, in Rome, in Syria, in the northern Arabian desert. Wherever Nabataean merchants traveled, they left marks on the landscape, recording their names, their prayers, their passing through. The inscriptions range from elaborate formal texts on tomb facades, carefully planned and beautifully carved, to the briefest of graffiti scratched with a sharp stone on a cliff face. They record the names of travelers and the dates of their passing. They record dedications to gods and prayers for safe journeys. They record the names of people who died in the desert and were buried where they fell. They are a form of correspondence between the living and whoever might come after them, a message scratched into the rock that says, "I was here. I passed through this place. I had a name." The development of the Nabataean script from its Aramaic roots into the distinctive cursive form that would eventually become the Arabic script is a story that can be traced through a sequence of inscriptions spanning several centuries. The earliest Nabataean inscriptions, from around the 2nd century BCE, still closely resemble their Aramaic parent. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the script had developed the connected, flowing letter forms that are the defining characteristic of Arabic calligraphy. The transition is gradual, continuous, and visible in the archaeological record. This means that the Arabic script, in which the Quran was written, and in which the poetry of the Islamic Golden Age was composed, and in which Arabic speakers today write their language, is a direct, linear descendant of the writing system used in Petra. The calligrapher, who writes a verse of the Quran today, is using a script whose shapes were formed over many centuries, from the script used by Nabataean merchants to record their business transactions and by Nabataean pilgrims to record their prayers on desert rocks. The continuity of the written form across the gap between Nabataean and Islamic civilization is one of the less visible but more profound connections between the ancient world and the present. The gap is real. The Nabataean language was replaced. The Nabataean religion was replaced. The Nabataean political structures were absorbed and then replaced. But the shapes of the letters persisted, adapting and evolving but never entirely discontinuous from what had come before. Petra is present, in a certain sense, in every piece of Arabic writing that exists. The mountains around Petra are not featureless, they are full of things. Most of the high ridges surrounding the city have carved elements at or near their summits. The great high place of sacrifice on the ridge, called Zib Atuf, which can be reached by a path from the valley floor and offers one of the best views of the entire site, has an elaborate complex of carved features. An altar carved flat from the top of the ridge, with a channel to drain blood or water or wine. A basin carved into the rock nearby for ritual washing. 2 obelisks carved from the ridge itself, not constructed but cut from the existing rock, in the same technique used for the facades in the valley below, standing against the sky at the highest point of the ridge. The obelisks are the most visible feature of the high place from a distance. They are simple in form, tapering from a square base to a pointed top, and they catch the light in the morning in a way that makes them seem to glow above the surrounding stone. From the high place, the entire valley of Petra is visible below. The colonnaded street, the temple complex, the theatre, the royal tombs on the eastern cliff, the Sikh entrance in the northeast, the broad plateau where the Badul village stood in more recent centuries. Everything that the city was and is can be seen from this height, spread out like a plan drawn in stone and light. The Nabataeans who climbed to this place to perform their rituals would have had the same view. Standing at the altar, facing whatever direction the ritual required, they would have seen their city laid out below them. The smoke of their sacrifices would have risen from this height and been visible from the valley floor, a column of smoke against the sky that signaled to those below that the relationship between the city and its gods was being maintained. The high place was not separate from the city. It was the city's relationship to the sky made visible. Other high places around Petra are less elaborate, but equally numerous. Almost every significant ridge has some carved feature, some evidence of Nabataean sacred activity. The landscape around Petra was saturated with sacred sites in the way that only a landscape that has been inhabited and venerated for a very long time can be. Every prominent natural feature, every spring, every unusual rock formation, every peak with a view, was a potential locus of divine presence in the Nabataean understanding of the world. The Byzantine period at Petra, which lasted from roughly the 4th century through the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, is less studied and less celebrated than the Nabataean period, but it is not uninteresting. The church, whose mosaic floor was discovered in the 1990s, was not the only Christian building at Petra. There is evidence of at least one other church complex in the city, and the tomb facades that line the cliff walls show evidence of Christian use, in the form of crosses carved into interior walls and niches for lamps and sacred objects. The city, that the Nabataeans had saturated with images of their own deities, was gradually resaturated with the images of a different tradition. The Bishop of Petra is attested in the records of church councils from the 4th century onward. The bishop sat alongside the bishops of other cities in the Roman province of Arabia, participating in the debates and controversies that defined the early Christian church. The Arian controversy, which divided the church in the 4th century over questions about the nature of Christ, had representatives on both sides from the churches of Arabia, including Petra. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which established the creed that became the foundation of Orthodox Christian theology, was attended by a bishop from Arabia Petraea. These are not the actions of a marginal community on the edge of the civilized world. These are the actions of a functioning Christian community that saw itself as a full participant in the life of the church. The papyrus documents discovered in the 1990s provide a window into the daily life of this community. They are property deeds and financial agreements, not theological texts. They record disputes about land and water rights, the kinds of disputes that arise in any community where resources are limited and people have long memories about who owns what. They mention the names of families who have been in Petra for generations, families with Nabataean-sounding names alongside Greek and Latin names, reflecting the mixed cultural heritage of the city's population by this period. They mention churches as landmarks and reference points, the way you might give directions by saying, "Take the second left past the church." The churches were already part of the landscape, already the kind of feature that people oriented themselves by. The quality of the mosaic floor discovered in the 1990s suggests that the Christian community of Byzantine Petra was not impoverished. The tesserae, the tiny square tiles from which the mosaic was made, are fine and numerous, and the images they depict are sophisticated. The personification of the ocean, shown as a large figure with marine creatures, is a classical motif handled with genuine artistic skill. The personifications of the seasons that border the floor are charming, each season represented as a female figure with attributes appropriate to her time of year. The whole composition reflects a community that was connected to the broader artistic traditions of the Byzantine world, that could commission skilled craftsmen, that valued the embellishment of its sacred spaces. This community was already dealing with a contracting city when the earthquake of 551 CE struck. The damage from that earthquake, combined with the damage still unrepaired from the earlier earthquake of 363 CE, reduced the inhabited area of Petra still further. The Bishop of Petra in the 6th century was the bishop of a smaller and less prosperous city than the one his predecessors had led in the 4th century. But the bishopric continued, the church continued, the community continued. Water and fire. These are the two forces that have done the most to shape what Petra looks like today. We have talked extensively about water, the water system the Nabataeans built, and the water damage that helped destroy the city after the earthquake. But fire also has a role in Petra's story, specifically the fires in the hearths of the people who lived in the canyon after the Nabataean period ended. The Bedouin, who sheltered in the carved rooms of Petra's cliff faces over the centuries, between the city's formal abandonment and their own relocation in the 1980s, left visible marks on the ceilings and walls of the drais, chambers they occupied. Cooking fires leave soot. Centuries of cooking fires in enclosed stone chambers leave thick black deposits of soot on ceilings and walls that can, paradoxically, help preserve the surfaces they cover by protecting them from direct weathering. But beyond the practical matter of soot, the Bedouin occupation of Petra represents a form of continuity that is important to acknowledge. The canyon was not entirely empty during the long centuries when Petra was forgotten by the outside world. People were there. They were living in the rooms that the Nabataeans had carved. They were sleeping in chambers where Nabataean priests had once performed rituals. They were cooking their food in spaces that had once been the tombs of kings. This kind of repurposing is not unusual in the history of ancient sites. The Parthenon in Athens has been, at various points in its history, a Greek temple, a Christian church, a mosque, and a Turkish ammunition storage facility. The Colosseum in Rome was, for centuries after its formal abandonment as an arena, a quarry for building materials, a place where families built houses in the medieval ruins, a fortress. Ancient buildings are repurposed because they represent enormous investments of human labor that later populations want to use rather than ignore. The Bedouin repurposing of Petra is somewhat different from these examples because it did not involve structural modification of the site. The Bedouin did not demolish walls or add new construction in ways that damaged the ancient fabric. They lived in what was there, carefully, the way people live in something that is not theirs, but that they depend on. Their presence preserved knowledge of the site during the centuries when the outside world had forgotten it. When Burckhardt arrived in 1812, he arrived not into an empty desert, but into a landscape inhabited by people who knew every chamber and every path and every spring. Without a Bedouin guide, he would not have entered the Sikh. Without Bedouin cooperation, he could not have seen the treasury. The rediscovery of Petra is, in part, the story of the Bedouin choosing to share their knowledge with an outsider. There is a temple at Petra that is not carved from the cliff. It is freestanding. It is built from stone blocks in the manner of temples in the Roman and Hellenistic world. It is called the Great Temple, a name given to it by archaeologists before its precise function was fully understood, and it occupies a prominent position in the center of the valley, just south of the colonnaded street. The Great Temple was excavated by a team from Brown University in the United States, beginning in the 1990s, and the excavations continued for many years, revealing a complex of surprising scale and unexpected features. The temple itself is substantial. Its precinct, including the colonnaded forecourt and the steps leading up to the main structure, covers an area of roughly 7,000 square meters. Its columns, when standing, would have been among the tallest in the city. But the most surprising discovery at the Great Temple was in its interior. In a later phase of the building's use, possibly during the early Roman period after the Nabataean Kingdom became a province, the interior of the main hall was converted into a small theatre. Rows of seats were cut from the stone floor of the temple interior, arranged in a semicircle around a small performance space. The theatre inside the temple could have held perhaps several hundred people. Why would someone build a theatre inside a temple? The answer may lie in the complex relationship between religious observance and performance in the ancient world. Theatrical performances in ancient Greece and Rome were not entirely separate from religious ritual. The great dramatic festivals of Athens were held in honor of Dionysus. Roman theatrical productions often had religious elements. The Nabataeans, synthesizing elements from different traditions, may have created a performance space within their largest temple complex for activities that blurred the line between ritual and entertainment, between prayer and drama, or the theatre may reflect the conversion of the space for a different purpose during the Roman period, when the building's original religious function had changed or diminished, and a new use was found for the interior space. The interpretation is not settled, but the existence of the theatre inside the temple is a reminder that ancient buildings had lives that changed over time, that were not fixed at a single moment of construction, that accumulated uses and meanings across the centuries. The frankincense that passed through Petra's markets has a story that does not end in the ancient world. Frankincense is still harvested from boswellia trees in Oman and Yemen and Somalia and Ethiopia. The same technique used 2,000 years ago, cutting the bark of the tree to induce the resin to bleed out, collecting the hardened resin after it has dried, loading it into containers for transport. The industry is much smaller than it was at its ancient peak. The markets for it are different, but the trees are still there, and people are still cutting them. And the resin still carries the same sharp, clean scent it carried when it was burned in the temples of the ancient Mediterranean world. The communities in southern Oman that have been harvesting frankincense for millennia still practice the craft with a depth of knowledge that has been passed down through generations. They know which trees produce the highest quality resin. They know the right season for tapping and the right number of times to tap a tree without stressing it into non-production the following year. They know how to read the quality of the hardened resin by its color and clarity, the same way a jeweler reads a gemstone. This knowledge is itself a form of cultural heritage, as fragile and as worthy of preservation as the stone facades of Petra. The boswellia trees themselves are under pressure from over-harvesting, from changes in land use, from the effects of climate change on the semi-arid ecosystems where they grow. Some species of boswellia are now classified as vulnerable or endangered. The trade that once flowed through Petra in quantities that required a system of caravanserais and water cisterns across 2,000 kilometers of desert is now a much reduced and precarious thing. There is something melancholy about this. The frankincense trade was one of the great economic forces of the ancient world. It shaped civilizations, it funded empires, it built Petra, and now the trees that produced it are struggling to survive in a world that has largely forgotten the role they once played. The silence of Petra, in the hours before the tourists arrive, is a specific kind of silence. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a place that has heard a great deal, across a very long time, and has stopped needing to fill the quiet with more noise. It is the silence of the desert, which is not actually silent at all, if you pay attention to it, but is quiet in a way that the sounds it does contain, wind, rock, the occasional bird, are not fighting against anything else. They are just there, in the space. The sandstone is porous in a particular way that affects acoustics. Sound is absorbed by the rock rather than reflected from it, which means that the carved spaces of Petra, the chambers and corridors and open facades, do not echo in the way you might expect. A sound made inside one of the larger carved chambers dies quickly. The walls take it in and hold it. This gives the spaces an intimacy that their size does not predict. You can speak in a normal voice in the khazne, the treasury chamber, and be heard clearly by someone standing a few meters away, even though the chamber is several meters high and several meters wide. The stone listens without amplifying. The early morning, before the tourist coaches arrive, before the vendors open their stalls, before the camels and horses that carry visitors through the valley are brought in from their overnight pasture, is the time when Petra most resembles itself. When the light is just beginning to touch the highest facades, when the water channels that still carry a trickle of water on wet mornings are the only sound, when the carved faces of the deities in their niches are looking at nothing and everything at once. There is a quality to this time that travelers who have been fortunate enough to experience it describe in similar terms, regardless of where they come from or what they expected to find. They describe a sense of presence, not of ghosts, not in the supernatural sense, but of accumulated time, of the weight of all the hours that have passed in this place since the first people cut the first niche into the first cliff face. The stone holds time differently from the way buildings hold it, because the stone was already ancient when the Nabataeans arrived. The Nabataeans added their work to something that was already there, something that already had its own long history of wind and water and geological time, and their additions are now themselves ancient, separated from us by 2,000 years, and the stone that held them is still older, by orders of magnitude, than anything human hands have done to it. Standing in Petra early in the morning, in the quiet before the day begins, You are standing at the intersection of scales of time that the human mind is not entirely equipped to comprehend. The geological time of the stone, measured in millions of years. The human time of the Nabataeans, measured in centuries. The modern time of the visitor, measured in hours. All of these are present simultaneously. The stone holds them all, without distinction. One of the things that makes Petra genuinely surprising for first-time visitors is how much of it is not on the main tourist path. The route that most visitors take, in from the Sikh, past the treasury, along the colonnaded street, to the Great Temple and Qasr al-Bint, covers maybe 15% of the total area of the ancient city. Beyond this main route, in every direction, there are valleys and ridges and cliff faces that most visitors never see. To the north of the main valley, there is a district called Turkmenia, where a long section of cliff face is covered in facades at various scales, most of them less elaborate than the royal tombs, but no less atmospheric for that. The path to Turkmenia passes through a quiet side valley where the vegetation is thicker than in the main valley, because the shade and the microclimate of the narrow space support more plant life. There are oleander bushes here, their pink flowers appearing in the spring against the red rock. There are wild figs growing in cracks in the cliff. There are birds in the fig trees, warblers and hoopoes, calling in the morning from the branches that overhang the path. To the south, beyond the main tourist zone, there are the remains of a district that seems to have been a centre of the pottery and metalworking industries in the Nabataean period. Kilns have been excavated here, workshops, the detritus of industrial production in the ancient world, broken kiln furniture, wasters, fragments of experimental glazes, the physical evidence of craftsmen experimenting and failing and learning and eventually producing the extraordinary thin painted pottery that made Nabataean ceramics famous across the ancient world. To the west, beyond Qasr al-Bint, the valley opens up and the cliffs recede, and the landscape takes on a different character. The agricultural terraces are more visible here, climbing the hillsides in stepped sequences that represent an enormous investment of labour. The path continues to the high places of the western ridge, and from the top of the ridge, the view extends westward across the Wadi Araba toward the distant red hills of the Negev desert in modern Israel, the same desert through which the ancient incense road passed. Every direction from the center of Petra leads to something worth seeing. The site rewards exploration and patience, and a willingness to leave the main path and find your own way through the landscape. The visitors who come for a few hours and see only the treasury and the colonnaded street have seen something remarkable. The visitors who stay for several days and walk the lesser-known paths and climb to the high places and sit in the side valleys in the afternoon light have seen something closer to what Petra actually is. The Nabataean Kingdom, at its peak, extended far beyond Petra. It was not a city-state. It was a kingdom with territory stretching from the Hejaz in the south to Syria in the north, from the desert to the Mediterranean coast. Within this territory, there were several other significant Nabataean cities. Oboda, in the Negev desert of what is today Israel, was an important Nabataean city along the caravan route. Its remains are substantial. There is a large temple precinct on a prominent hill, the ruins of a wine press that produced wine for local consumption and for trade, and a system of agricultural terraces and runoff farms that allowed agriculture in an extremely arid environment. The Nabataean wine produced in the Negev was considered of high quality and was traded across the region. Mamshit, also in the Negev, has some of the best preserved Nabataean residential architecture outside of Petra. Its houses are built from local stone in a consistent style, and some of them retain their upper floor walls to considerable height, giving a sense of what Nabataean domestic architecture actually looked like from the street. The city also has two Byzantine period churches, reflecting the continuation of occupation into the later period. Hegra, in the Hejaz region of what is today Saudi Arabia, has recently been opened to tourism after many decades of restricted access. It is sometimes called Little Petra or the Madain Sali, and its carved tomb facades, cut into isolated freestanding rocks of sandstone rather than cliff faces, are in many cases better preserved than those at Petra. because they have been less exposed to the moisture and vegetation that weather the stone in the more temperate Jordan Valley. The facades at Hegra are extraordinary. They stand alone in the desert, isolated towers of stone carved with the same vocabulary of columns and pediments and decorative reliefs that appears at Petra, but in a landscape of flat desert rather than canyon. The effect is surreal, as if the facades had been transported from their natural context and set down in the middle of the empty sand. These other Nabataean cities tell us that the civilization that produced Petra was not a one-city phenomenon. It was a kingdom with an urban culture spread across a large territory, with consistent artistic and architectural traditions, a functioning road network, and enough organized administrative capacity to maintain cities and manage trade across long distances. Petra was the capital and the showpiece, the place where the most elaborate expression of Nabataean culture was concentrated. But it was not alone. The sound of the sick at night, in the time before electric lighting, before the tourist infrastructure that now lines the path, must have been extraordinary. Travelers approaching Petra in the dark, guided by someone who knew the path, would have heard the canyon before they could see it. The wind moving through the narrow passage creates sounds, not quite music, not quite voice, that change as the direction of the wind changes and as the shape of the canyon bends and widens. The carved channels along the walls carry water in the wet season, and the sound of water in a stone channel, in an enclosed space, is amplified and directed in ways that can make it seem to come from everywhere at once. The carved niches in the canyon walls, with their carved deity figures now mostly worn smooth, would have glowed in torchlight as travelers passed them. The niches were regularly replenished with offerings and kept clean, and in the flickering light of a torch, they would have seemed animated, the carved faces moving in the uncertain light. Approaching Petra through the Seek at night, a traveler arriving for the first time, or even for the 1000th time, would have felt the particular quality of passage that the canyon was designed to create. The transition from the open desert, with its unlimited sky and its clear sense of self in relation to the horizon, to the enclosed canyon, where the sky is a narrow ribbon and the walls press close, is a transition designed to make you feel small and aware of your own smallness. And then the canyon opens and the treasury is there. In torchlight, the treasury would look very different from what it looks like in the clear desert daylight. The carved reliefs would cast deeper shadows. The colors of the stone would be warmer, the oranges and reds enriched by the orange light of flame. The columns would seem taller because the upper portions would fade into darkness. The eyes of the carved figures in the pediments would seem to follow the light. The whole facade would have a quality of presence, of watching, that the daylight version, for all its magnificence, does not quite achieve. The Nabataeans were not unaware of these effects. The choice to place the treasury at the end of the Seek, revealed through the final bend of the canyon, was a deliberate aesthetic and perhaps religious decision. The approach was designed. The experience of arrival was designed. The narrow, dark passage, followed by the revelation of the bright facade, was not accidental. It was theatre, in the oldest and most fundamental sense of the word, a controlled experience of transition from one state of being to another. In the end, what do we know about the people who built Petra? We know they were traders. We know they were engineers. We know they were artists. We know they were desert survivors with an intimate knowledge of their landscape. We know they built extraordinary things, and that those things have lasted for 2,000 years. We know less about who they were to each other. What it felt like to be a child in Petra, growing up among the carved cliff faces, thinking of them as simply the background of everyday life, as unremarkable as the mountains themselves, because you had always known them. What it felt like to be a camel driver arriving in the city after 60 days in the desert, carrying a load of frankincense from the south, the smell of the city's water fountains, the first sensation that told you the journey was nearly over. What it felt like to be a craftsman, putting the finishing touches on the carved decorations of a new tomb facade, knowing that the face you were carving into the stone might last longer than anything else your life would produce. The Nabataean people did not leave us their literature. They left their inscriptions, brief and formulaic by necessity. They left their art, which tells us what they valued and what they feared, and what they believed was worth carving into permanent stone. They left their architecture, which tells us about their engineering knowledge and their aesthetic preferences and their relationship to the landscape. They left their pottery, which tells us about their craft traditions and their trading connections and their daily domestic life. From all of these, we can construct a portrait, but it is an incomplete portrait. The personality behind the carved facades, the inner life of the civilization, remains partly in shadow. This is always the condition of studying the ancient world. The people are present in their things, but the things are not the people. There is always a gap between the artifacts and the consciousness that made them. What we can say with certainty is that the Nabataeans made something that was worth making, that the city they built in the Red Canyon of the Jordanian desert was an achievement of the human spirit that deserves to be known and remembered and visited and wondered at, that the water they stored in the rock and the tombs they carved in the cliff and the trade they organized across the desert were all expressions of a civilization that found a way to flourish in one of the least hospitable environments on Earth, and that did so not by conquering the landscape, but by understanding it and working with it. The stone of Petra is still red. The light still comes in at the angles it always came in. The carved facades are still there, a little more weathered than they were, but fundamentally unchanged from what the Nabataeans left. The treasury still stands at the end of the Seek, still revealing itself suddenly around the final bend of the canyon, still producing the same intake of breath in whoever sees it for the first time. 2,000 years on, the work of the Nabataeans is still working, still astonishing, still, somehow, new. That is the real legacy of Petra. Not the wealth of the trade routes, or the sophistication of the water system, or the brilliance of the architecture. The real legacy is the experience it produces in whoever encounters it. The particular combination of astonishment and humility and awe that comes from standing in a canyon and looking up at something human hands made 2,000 years ago from the living rock of the earth. That experience is not diminished by time. It may, in fact, be deepened by it. The Nabataeans could not have imagined us, standing in their canyon with our cameras and our air-conditioned buses and our 2-day tourist visas, but they carved their city into a substance that would survive long enough for us to come and see it. Whether that was their intention is something we cannot know, but the effect is what it is. The stone outlasted them, and it is outlasting us too, slowly, in the patient way of geological things, while we pass through it and take our photographs and try to understand what we are looking at. We are looking at time. We are looking at what survives. We are looking at what human beings can do when they bring their full intelligence and skill and will to bear on the problem of making something in the world. We are looking at Petra, and Petra is looking back from the eyes of the carved figures in the facade, in the way that things carved from stone always look back, without moving, without blinking, across all the years that separate them from whoever is standing in front of them now. Sleep well. The canyon will be there in the morning. History for sleep. Number. The deeper story. What the stones remember. There is a question that sits underneath all of the history we have been moving through tonight. A question that the stones of Petra ask without being able to answer. What is a city for? In one sense, the answer seems obvious. A city is for people. People gather in cities because density creates opportunity, because markets require customers, and customers require proximity, because defense is easier when walls can be shared, because the division of labor that makes specialization possible requires enough people in one place to support specialists who produce nothing that can be eaten or worn, but who nonetheless contribute something that the community cannot do without. Doctors, priests, architects, teachers. But Petra complicates this obvious answer in an interesting way, because Petra was not primarily a city for the people who lived in it. It was a city for the people who passed through it. The permanent population of Petra, even at its peak, was probably a minority of the people who occupied the city at any given moment. The caravans that passed through, the merchants and their drivers and their guards and their animals would have swelled the population enormously during the active trading seasons. The pilgrims who came to the high places and the temples and the tombs of important dead would have added more. The diplomats and merchants from Rome and Egypt and the Hellenistic world who came to negotiate and trade would have added more still. Petra was a city of flows, of movement, of people coming and going, and the permanent population was the infrastructure that made the flows possible. This is, in some ways, a more modern model of a city than we usually associate with the ancient world. The modern port city, the modern airport hub, the modern financial center, these are places whose primary function is to facilitate the movement of goods and money and people, and whose permanent populations are in some sense the staff of that facilitation. Petra was that kind of place 2,000 years before the concept was articulated in modern economic geography. The Nabataeans understood this implicitly in the way they designed and organized their city. The major public spaces of Petra, the colonnaded street, the market areas, the forum, were designed to accommodate large numbers of people who were not permanent residents. The caravanserai complexes outside the city walls were built on a scale that suggests they regularly housed hundreds of animals and their handlers simultaneously. The water system was designed to supply not just the permanent population, but the constantly varying additional population of travelers and traders. This orientation toward the transient visitor, rather than the permanent resident, has an interesting implication for how we think about what was lost when Petra declined. The permanent population that remained in the city during the long centuries of decline was a remnant of something that had been built to serve a much larger and more dynamic community. The infrastructure of the great trading city, the water system, and the public buildings, and the market spaces were designed at a scale that a small permanent population could not maintain. Without the revenue from the caravan tolls, without the economic activity that had justified and funded the elaborate infrastructure, the city began to shrink toward the size that its diminished permanent population could sustain. This process of a city contracting to the scale its permanent population can support after the transient population that drove its growth departs is not unique to Petra. It is the story of many port cities and trading centers when their trade routes shifted. When the economic logic that built a city changes, the city changes with it. The fortunate cities find new economic logics. The less fortunate ones shrink or disappear. Petra was not fortunate in this respect. It had been built for a specific function in a specific moment of world trade, and when that function became obsolete and that moment passed, there was no obvious replacement for it. The relationship between the Nabataean Kingdom and the Arabian Peninsula in the centuries following the kingdom's annexation by Rome is not well documented, but it is not unimportant. The Arabian Peninsula, in the 1st century CE, was a complex political and cultural landscape. The south, the region of modern Yemen, was home to a series of sophisticated kingdoms, the most famous of them being the Kingdom of Saba, whose queen appears in both the Hebrew Bible and the Quran in the stories about Solomon. The Kingdom of Himyar eventually unified much of southern Arabia and persisted well into the Islamic period. The central and northern Arabian Peninsula was home to a variety of tribal confederacies and smaller polities, some of them in close contact with the Nabataean world and the wider Roman and Persian empires that surrounded Arabia on its northern and western and eastern edges. After the Roman annexation of the Nabataean Kingdom in 106 CE, the Nabataean trading networks did not simply disappear. They were absorbed into the Roman provincial system, but the people who had operated them, the merchants and guides and caravan masters and logistics specialists, continued to do what they had always done. The trade routes continued to function. The goods continued to flow. The knowledge of the desert routes that the Nabataeans had accumulated over centuries did not vanish when the kingdom did. It survived in the practice of the people who had always used it. Some of these people, over the generations following the annexation, moved into the Arabian interior. Some remained in the cities of the former kingdom, now Roman provincial towns. Some became part of the broader late antique world of the Roman East, their Nabataean identity gradually blurring into the regional culture of Roman Arabia and then of Byzantine Arabia, and finally, for those who lived long enough, into the world that came after the Islamic conquests, the tribal confederacies of Central and Northern Arabia that would eventually produce the political and religious movement of early Islam in the 7th century CE, were connected to the post-Nabataean world in ways that historians are still working to understand. The trade networks of the Arabian Peninsula, the routes along which goods and ideas and religious influences had been flowing for centuries, were the same networks that carried the message of the new religion southward from the Hejaz and northward into Syria and beyond. The infrastructure of connectivity that the Nabataeans had helped to build, the knowledge of desert routes and water sources and trading relationships, was still present in the landscape and in the people when Islam emerged. The perfume industry of the ancient world is worth understanding as its own phenomenon, separate from the broader incense trade, though connected to it. The Nabataeans were not just middlemen in the perfume trade, they were manufacturers. Archaeological excavations at several Nabataean sites have revealed evidence of perfume production, the extraction and blending of aromatic oils from plant materials. The Nabataean city of Oboda, in the Negev desert, has yielded particularly good evidence of this industry. The basic technique of ancient perfume production involved maceration, the soaking of plant materials in oil to transfer the aromatic compounds from the plant into the oil carrier. Different plant materials require different oils and different durations of maceration to achieve the desired result. The art of the perfumer in the ancient world was the art of knowing which plants, in which ratios, macerated, for which duration, in which oil, produced a result that people would pay for. The perfume trade was lucrative for a reason that may not be immediately obvious. Before the development of modern soap and modern water infrastructure, personal hygiene in the ancient world was considerably more challenging than it is today. Wealthy people in Rome bathed regularly. But even regular bathing, in the absence of effective cleansing agents, did not entirely address the problem of human odor. Perfume served a function that was partly aesthetic and partly practical. It covered odors that could not be eliminated. It made social proximity tolerable. It marked status in a society where smell, like dress and diet, was a social signal. The aromatic substances produced in the Nabataean perfume workshops, whether exported in finished form or in raw ingredients, reached consumers across the Roman world. Perfume merchants in Rome and Alexandria and Antioch sold products that may have originated in workshops along the caravan routes through the Nabataean Kingdom. The cedar oil and myrrh and frankincense and Arabian spices that filled the shelves of ancient pharmacies and perfume shops were connected, through the logic of the incense road and the Nabataean trade network, to the Red Canyon in the Jordanian desert. The natural setting of Petra has been changing more rapidly in the modern era than in any previous period of its history, and not all of the changes are visible to the casual visitor. The groundwater table in the Petra region has been dropping for decades, as modern agricultural use and the demands of the growing town of Wadi Musa, just outside the site, draw on water resources that the ancient water management system also depended on. The spring that was the primary source for the ancient pipe system still flows, but at a lower volume than it would have during the Nabataean period. The cisterns that the Nabataeans carved into the rock, some of them still structurally sound after 2,000 years, would fill more slowly today than they would have in the past, even if the maintenance infrastructure to fill them existed. The vegetation in and around the site has also changed. The ancient Petra Valley was not forested, but it had more vegetation than it does today. The overgrazing of the region over centuries of pastoralism has reduced the plant cover on the hillsides, which has increased runoff during rainstorms and reduced the amount of water that infiltrates into the ground. The very flash floods that occasionally sweep through the sick and damage the site are partly the result of changed vegetation patterns on the hillsides above the canyon. The oleander that grows in the Petra Valley today is attractive, with its pink flowers and its dark green leaves. But it is also invasive, crowding out other plant species that would have been present in the historical landscape. The ancient agricultural terraces, when they were in active use, would have been planted with crops, vines, olive trees, the food production that supported the city's permanent population. Today, the terraces are largely abandoned, their walls still visible but their planting beds empty or overgrown. Understanding the historical ecology of the Petra landscape, what it looked like before human intervention, what it looked like during the period of maximum Nabataean occupation, and how it has changed since, is an ongoing project of research. that involves archaeobotanists and paleoecologists, as well as archaeologists and historians. The results of this research will help to contextualize the ancient city in its environment in ways that simple architectural study cannot. There is a category of Nabataean building that does not appear in the cliff faces and is not found in the formal structures of the main valley. It is found along the roads that led to Petra, scattered across the landscape of the surrounding desert. These are the roadside structures, the way stations and caravanserais and small temples and water points that marked the routes approaching the city from every direction. They were the first and last points of contact between the Nabataean Kingdom and the travelers who passed through it, and they were designed, like everything else the Nabataeans built, with the logic of the desert traveler firmly in mind. A traveler approaching Petra from the south, from the direction of the Arabian Peninsula, would have entered Nabataean territory days before reaching the city. The transition from the open desert where no one governed to the territory where the Nabataean system applied would have been marked by the first encounter with a Nabataean way station, water here, a guard post there, a carved inscription on a rock face in Nabataean script that told those who could read it that they were now in organized territory. As the traveler moved northward through the desert, the way stations would have become more frequent and more developed. Small rooms for shelter, cisterns for water, stabling for animals, and, increasingly, signs of the religious world of the Nabataean Kingdom, carved niches with deity figures, small altars for offerings, inscriptions recording the dedications of travelers who had passed this way and survived the journey. By the time a traveler arrived at the outer approaches to Petra itself, having passed through a landscape increasingly marked by the symbols of Nabataean cultural and religious presence, the transition from the dangerous empty desert to the safety and order of the Nabataean city would have felt less like a crossing of a threshold and more like a gradual drawing in. The Nabataean Kingdom did not begin at a gate. It began, perceptibly, in the landscape itself, in the marks that the Nabataeans had made on the desert through which their routes passed. This gradual transition was deliberate. It was marketing, in the most fundamental sense. It was the Nabataeans telling travelers, through the physical evidence of the landscape, "We are here. We have organized this. Under our protection, you will reach your destination safely. Trust us." The trust, once established, was worth more than any single toll could have been. Repeat customers, in the ancient world as in the modern world, are the foundation of a sustainable business. The Nabataean Kingdom's greatest asset was not its military strength, or its access to water, or its strategic location. It was its reputation for reliability in an environment where reliability was extremely rare. There is a particular quality to the afternoon light in the Petra Valley that travelers who have spent more than a single day at the site consistently remark on. It is different from the morning light and different from the evening light, and it is different from the harsh overhead light of midday. In the middle of the afternoon, roughly between 2 and 4 o'clock, depending on the season, the sun is at an angle that catches the cliff faces on the western side of the valley in a way that reveals colors in the stone that are not visible at any other time of day. The pinks and purples in the sandstone, which are present but subdued in other lights, come forward in the afternoon. The stone seems almost translucent in this light, as if the colors are coming from inside rather than being reflected from the surface. The carved facades on the western cliffs, particularly the monastery on the heights above, are at their most spectacular in this light. The phenomenon is well known to photographers and guides. The golden hour of the morning and the evening get most of the attention, because the low-angle light in those periods is dramatic and the colors are warm and the shadows are long. But the purple afternoon light is its own kind of beautiful, quieter, more complex, more easily missed. The Nabataeans built where they built for reasons of water and defense and trade. But it seems unlikely that they were entirely indifferent to the aesthetic qualities of the landscape they were building in. The choice to place the treasury at the end of the Seek, to build the high places on the peaks with the widest views, to create the artificial plateaus and the rock-cut dining rooms in positions that look out over the valley, suggests a people with an eye for their setting. Whether the afternoon light on the western cliffs was something they noticed and appreciated is something we cannot know, but it seems likely, in the way that people who live somewhere long enough to know every face of it tend to know and appreciate the particular beauties of the place they call home. The story of Petra is not yet finished. That is perhaps the most important thing to say as we approach the end of our time in this Red Canyon tonight. The archaeological work at Petra is ongoing. Every year, new excavations reveal new aspects of the ancient city. The survey work, the systematic documentation of the entire site and its surroundings, continues to identify features that have not been previously recorded. The conservation work, the effort to stabilize and preserve what exists before further deterioration occurs, is a constant and expanding enterprise. In 2016, researchers using satellite imagery and aerial photography identified a previously unknown monumental structure at Petra, a large platform or ceremonial avenue that had not been recognized as a significant architectural feature in the previous 2 centuries of work at the site. It was hiding in plain sight, its features visible only at the scale and from the angle that satellite photography provides. The discovery was a reminder that Petra has not yet given up all of its secrets, that even the most studied archaeological site in the region still has things to reveal to those who look carefully enough. The work of the next generation of archaeologists at Petra will be shaped by technologies that did not exist when the first excavations began. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal buried structures without excavation. LiDAR scanning can produce precise 3-dimensional maps of surface features at resolutions impossible to achieve with conventional survey methods. Isotope analysis of human remains can reveal information about the diet and geographic origins of ancient individuals. Ancient DNA analysis can reveal the genetic heritage of the people buried in the cliff tombs. Each of these technologies adds a new layer to the portrait that is being assembled of the Nabataean civilization. The portrait will never be complete. That is the nature of the archaeological enterprise. But it will continue to grow richer and more detailed with each generation of researchers who devote their working lives to understanding what the people of Petra were and how they lived. The stones hold more than we have yet learned to ask them. The city of Wadi Musa, the modern town that sits adjacent to the Petra Archaeological Park, has grown dramatically in the decades since Petra was opened to international tourism. Before the development of tourism infrastructure in the 1980s, Wadi Musa was a small agricultural village. Today, it is a substantial town with hotels and restaurants and souvenir shops, and a population that has grown several times over from what it was 40 years ago. The relationship between the modern town and the ancient site is complex. The tourism economy that Petra brings to the region is the primary economic driver of Wadi Musa and the surrounding area. Without Petra, the town would be a fraction of its current size. The people who live there know this, and they have invested in the infrastructure needed to host the visitors that Petra attracts. But the growth of the town has not been without cost. The water demands of the expanded population draw on the same aquifers that supply the ancient springs that fed the Nabataean water system. The construction of hotels and roads has, in some cases, disturbed archaeological deposits in areas outside the formerly protected park boundaries. The traffic and noise and activity of a busy tourist town impinge on the edges of a site that deserves quiet. These are tensions that appear at archaeological sites around the world, and they do not have easy resolutions. The people who live in Wadi Musa have as much right to economic development as anyone else. The site of Petra belongs to the heritage of all humanity, in the formal sense conferred by its UNESCO World Heritage designation. But it also belongs specifically to Jordan and to the region, and the Jordanian government has legitimate interests in managing it for both preservation and economic return. The balance between preservation and access, between protecting the ancient site and allowing it to serve the economic and cultural needs of the people who live near it, is a negotiation that will continue for as long as Petra exists. It is a negotiation without a permanent solution, because the interests involved are real and genuine and not entirely compatible, and the best that can be achieved is an ongoing management of the tension rather than a resolution of it. In the spring, when the winter rains have been good, the Petra Valley is transformed. The floor of the valley, bare and dusty in the dry months, fills with a brief flush of green. Grasses and small annual plants push up through the sandy soil. The oleander, along the seasonal watercourses, puts out its pink flowers. Poppies appear on the terraces and hillsides, red and fragile, lasting only a few weeks before the spring warmth fades them. Wild herbs, thyme, and sage and others release their scents when walked on, filling the warm air of the valley with an intensity that is quite different from the dry, dusty smell of the summer months. The birds that pass through the region during the spring migration are extraordinary. The Petra Valley, sitting as it does at the junction of the African and Eurasian continental land masses, in the middle of the great bird migration route that follows the Rift Valley northward from Africa, is on the flyway, used by millions of migrating birds each spring. In the weeks of peak migration, the valley can be home to dozens of species simultaneously. Bee-eaters in their improbable colors, rollers, flashing blue and rust, raptors riding the thermals off the heated cliff faces, warblers in the bushes along the watercourse. The dawn chorus in the Petra Valley in late April can be remarkably loud for a place that is usually so quiet. The Nabataeans would have known this. They lived in this valley across its annual cycle, and the return of migrating birds in the spring would have been as familiar to them as the return of the winter rains, as natural a part of the year as the flowering of the spring plants and the warming of the air after the cold months. The annual rhythms of the natural world would have structured their calendar in ways that our climate-controlled, electrically lit lives no longer require of us. The first poppy of spring would have meant something. The last day of autumn warmth would have meant something. The first flock of migrating storks overhead would have meant something. We have lost much of this. Not entirely, in the places where people still live close to the land, but largely, the annual rhythms of the natural world still operate, but we are increasingly insulated from them. And the insulation is a kind of impoverishment that we rarely notice until we spend time somewhere like Petra, where the landscape is so present and so large and so unchanged from what it has always been, that the annual rhythms become unavoidable again. Let us end where we began, with the land. Before the Nabataeans arrived, the land was there. The red mountains and the hidden valley and the springs emerging from the rock and the stars wheeling overhead. The land did not need the Nabataeans to be what it was. It was already extraordinary. It was already ancient beyond anything that human beings had made. The Nabataeans came and found the land and understood it, and worked with it, and carved their city into it, and lived there for centuries, and built something remarkable. And then they were gone, absorbed into the larger flows of history, their kingdom a province, their language evolving into something new, their script transforming slowly into the writing system that would carry the words of the Quran, and the land remained. The red mountains remained. The hidden valley remained. The springs remained, the stars remained. Other people came, Romans and Byzantines, and early Muslims, and Crusaders, and Bedouin, and eventually archaeologists, and tourists, and conservation teams, and scholars, and photographers, and schoolchildren on field trips, and honeymooners, and solo travelers, people who cannot quite explain why they felt they needed to come here, but who knew that they did. And the land remained. This is what rock does. It remains. It persists across scales of time that make human civilizations look like the briefest of incidents. The sandstone of the Petra Mountains was laid down over millions of years in ancient seabeds and rivers and wind-blown dunes. It was uplifted and tilted and eroded by forces that had nothing to do with human desire or human intelligence or human ambition. It became red because of the iron in the sand that became the rock. It became layered in colors because each layer was deposited under slightly different conditions over millions of years of geological time. And then the Nabataeans arrived, and they cut into it, and they found the colors inside it, and they built their city in it, and from it, and within it, and the rock held their work. As it holds everything, as it will hold whatever comes next, for as long as the mountains stand. That is the final thing to say about Petra. It is not just a human achievement. It is not just an architectural marvel, or an engineering accomplishment, or a trading empire, or a lost civilization. It is the meeting point between human ambition and geological time, and it is one of the places on Earth where the gap between those two scales is most visible and most beautiful. The humans who built it are long gone. The rock remains, and in the rock, the work of the humans remains too. Preserved, protected, held. as if the mountain never wanted to let it go. Tonight, the carved faces of Petra are looking out at the desert in the dark, as they have for 2,000 years, seeing nothing and everything, patient in the way that only stone can be patient. Sleep well. History for sleep. Number. Closing meditations. The city that time could not erase. There is a particular quality of waiting that belongs to ancient things. Not the restless waiting of a person expecting something, not the anxious waiting of someone who fears what might come. The waiting of stone is different. It is the waiting of something that has already seen everything that is worth seeing, and is content to see whatever comes next without preference or anticipation. When you sit in the Petra Valley in the early evening, after most of the tourists have left, and the light is doing what the light does at that hour in the Jordanian desert, the city has this quality. It is not indifferent. That would be the wrong word. It is attentive, in the way that something very old is attentive, with a patience that comes from having outlasted everything that seemed important once, and finding that the light is still beautiful, and the stars are still overhead, and the stone is still red. The Nabataean merchants who built this city were not, by any account, a contemplative people. They were practical people, traders, engineers, logistics specialists. They were concerned with water and roads and tolls and the price of frankincense. They were concerned with the safety of their caravans and the reliability of their guides and the quality of their pottery and the loyalty of their kings. They built temples because they believed in their gods, and they carved tombs because they loved their dead and believed the dead deserved something lasting. But the spiritual dimension of their civilization was expressed through practice and craft rather than through philosophical writing. And yet what they left behind invites contemplation in a way that very few ancient sites do. The carved facades ask to be looked at slowly. They do not yield their meanings quickly. They have to be approached, the way you approach a person you want to know better, with patience and attention and the willingness to spend more time than you think you need. The incense road that made Petra great was, in a very literal sense, a road of prayer. The frankincense and myrrh that travelled along it were not luxury goods in the modern sense of something superfluous and expensive and pleasant, but not necessary. They were the material of religious practice. They were prayer made physical. The smoke of frankincense rising from a temple altar was not decoration. It was communication, the visible form of a petition rising from the human world toward the divine world that the ancients located somewhere above the smoke. To understand the scale of this communication is to understand something important about the ancient world that we often miss when we study it. The ancient world prayed constantly, not in the private, silent way that prayer sometimes takes in modern religious practice, but publicly, materially, at vast expense. The temples of Egypt burned thousands of kilograms of frankincense annually. The temples of Rome did the same. The domestic shrines in private homes burned incense on a daily basis. The festivals and public ceremonies that punctuated the ancient calendar all involved the burning of aromatic substances in quantities that a modern observer would find extraordinary. All of this incense had to come from somewhere. The somewhere was the frankincense forests of southern Arabia and East Africa, a small and specific ecosystem in a distant region. The road between the forests and the temples was 2,000 kilometers of desert and mountain and valley, requiring months of travel, enormous logistical infrastructure, and a system of commercial relationships that had been built and maintained over centuries. Petra was at the heart of this system. In a sense, then, every prayer offered in a Roman temple with frankincense was connected to Petra. The smoke that rose to the gods was carried there on camels that had passed through the Nabataean Kingdom and been watered from Nabataean cisterns and guided by Nabataean escorts and taxed by Nabataean kings. The divine communication of the ancient Mediterranean world travelled through the Red Canyon of Petra, on its way from the earth to wherever prayers go. This is not a small thing. It makes Petra something more than a trading city. It makes it a node in the spiritual economy of the ancient world, a place through which the material and the sacred were continuously passing in both directions. The gods received their incense, the Nabataeans received their toll. The frankincense forests were tapped each season. The caravans walked north, the trade went on. There is a silence that comes after a long story, a particular quality of quiet that is not absence but presence. The story has been told, the names have been spoken, the history has been traced, from its beginnings to its end, and then past its end into the strange afterlife of discovery and rediscovery and ongoing existence. And what is left is the silence of the thing itself, the canyon and the carved faces and the red stone and the stars. The Nabataeans named their gods and built their temples and buried their kings and organized their trade routes and collected their tolls and drank their water from cisterns carved in rock and made their thin, beautiful pottery and inscribed their names on desert rocks and prayed to the morning star and honored the mountains in which they lived. And then they were absorbed into Rome, and Rome became Byzantine, and Byzantine became Islamic. And the centuries passed, and the trade routes moved, and the population declined, and the earthquakes came, and the last inhabitants left, and the desert returned, and the sand settled over the colonnaded street, and the carved facades stared at an empty valley, and the stars continued to wheel overhead exactly as they had always done. And then a Swiss explorer, in an Arabic disguise, turned the final corner of the Sick one August morning in 1812 and looked up at the treasury and understood what he was seeing. And then the scholars came, and then the artists, and then the tourists, and then the archaeologists with their systematic methods and their careful documentation, and then the conservators with their chemical stabilizers and their stone consolidants, and then the satellite imagery and the ground-penetrating radar, and the ancient DNA analysis, and all the tools that the modern world brings to the problem of understanding the ancient one. And through all of this, the stone remained, red and patient and layered in its colors, holding the carved work of the Nabataeans inside itself, the way the earth holds everything that has ever been committed to it, neither releasing it easily nor refusing it. The city that was carved into a cliff still stands in the cliff, not perfectly, not entirely. The edges are softer than they were. The reliefs are less sharp. The colors of the painted plaster that once lined the interiors of the carved chambers have mostly faded or been lost entirely. Some of the facades have collapsed, the rock behind them weakened by water or earthquake, or the slow dissolution of the mineral bonds that hold sandstone together over geological time. But the treasury is still there. The monastery is still there. The royal tombs are still there. The Sikh is still there. The high places are still there. The carved channels in the cliff walls are still there, waiting for water to flow through them again, waiting as stone waits, without impatience, across whatever time remains. You have been to Petra tonight. You have walked through the Sikh in the cool early morning and seen the treasury appear in the gap between the canyon walls. You have stood in the theatre and looked across the valley at the cliff of the royal tombs. You have climbed the ancient staircase to the monastery and looked out from the carved threshold across the mountains to the edge of the world. You have sat in the triclinium where Nabataean families ate with their dead and felt the particular quality of a space that has been shaped for the presence of both the living and the departed. You have heard the story of the Nabataeans, the desert traders who became architects, the nomads who became engineers, the caravan guides who became kings. You have heard the story of their city, from its earliest Neolithic inhabitants through the Iron Age, Edomites through the Nabataean, flowering through the Roman absorption, through the Byzantine continuation, through the earthquake damage, through the gradual decline and the final departure of the last inhabitants and the long silence that followed. You have heard the story of the rediscovery, the Swiss traveller in his Arabic disguise, the French artists with their sketchbooks, the Scottish poet who wrote the line that everyone quotes, the archaeologists who came after them with more systematic intentions and more careful methods. And you have heard, because it is part of the story, about the ongoing life of the site, the conservation challenges, the tourism pressures, the still unfinished business of understanding what the Nabataeans were and how they lived and what happened to them. This is the story of Petra. Not all of it. No one's telling of it can ever be all of it. The stones know more than we have learned to ask them. The desert knows more than the stones. The sky knows more than the desert. But this is as much of the story as one night can hold. And it is, in its way, enough. The Red Canyon is there, tonight, in the Jordanian desert. The carved faces are looking out at the dark. The spring is flowing, quietly, through its channel in the rock. The stars are overhead, unchanged, unconcerned. Somewhere, a camel coughs in the dark outside the park. The sound carries across the quiet, and then the silence returns, and it is enough. History for sleep. Thank you for spending the night in the Red Canyon. Sleep well, wherever you are. Number A. Final walk through the valley. Before we close entirely, let us take one more slow walk through the city. Not to cover new ground, but to let the ground settle. We enter the Seek in the hour before dawn, when the canyon is at its most absolute in its darkness. The walls rise on either side, blocking out the stars, and we are inside the rock completely. The path beneath our feet is worn smooth by the passage of everyone who has ever walked this way, and there have been many. Edomites carrying goods to the valley, Nabataean priests heading to the morning ceremony at the Great Temple, Greek merchants arriving from Alexandria with olive oil and wine and news from the Mediterranean world, Roman soldiers on garrison duty, boots ringing on the stone, Byzantine pilgrims on their way to the tomb of Aaron on the peak above, Crusader knights in their heavy armor, impractical in the desert heat, Bedouin women with water jars balanced on their heads, and then the later arrivals, Burkhart in his disguise, the French artists with their sketchbooks, the Victorian ladies in their long skirts, who nonetheless climbed to the high places because the view was worth the effort. We are in very good company in the Seek, the company of everyone who has ever walked here. Their footsteps preceded ours, and the footsteps of others will follow. The canyon does not distinguish between us. The carved niches in the walls pass on either side. The deity figures in them are worn now, their features soft with erosion, their identities ambiguous. But the niches themselves are still clearly what they were designed to be: thresholds, markers of the transition from the outside world to the world of the city. We are passing through the entrance to a place that has been made sacred by long usage, if by nothing else. The canyon bends, and bends again, and the walls seem to close in, then open slightly, then close in again. The path is not straight. Nothing about the approach to Petra is straight. It is a path that teaches patience, that requires you to give up the desire to see ahead and simply walk. And then, as we have said before, and will say again because it deserves repetition, the canyon makes its final turn. A sliver of light appears ahead, and in that light, framed by the darkness of the canyon walls on either side, the treasury is there. We stop, we look, we take the time that the moment requires. The columns catch the early light and seem to glow with it. The carved figures in the upper pediment are in shadow still, their faces turned toward the darkness. The stone around the carved elements is its particular shade of rose and amber at this hour, the colors that the desert light of early morning produces on this specific stone in this specific place. We stand here for a while. There is no reason to hurry. The city has been waiting for 2,000 years for someone to stand here and look at it properly. A few more minutes of attention are owed. Then we walk forward, out of the Seek and into the valley, and the full extent of the city opens up around us. The theatre is to the left. Its stone seats, many of them still in place, curve up the hillside in their ancient geometry. The stage is empty. The last performance here was more than 1,000 years ago, but the theatre is still legible as what it was, still shaped for performance, still oriented toward the central space where the actors stood and the voices carried up to the seats, and the audience sat in whatever the Nabataean and then Roman equivalent of anticipation was. Theatre is one of the oldest technologies for doing what stories do, gathering people together in a shared space and directing their collective attention towards something, a narrative, a character, an idea, for a period of time, long enough for that thing to enter them and change how they think about something. The Greeks understood this. The Romans understood this. The Nabataeans, who built this theatre and presumably filled it with performances of some kind, also understood this. The technology has changed. The medium has changed. But here you are, at whatever hour of the night this finds you, listening to a voice telling you a story about a place you may never have visited, about people who have been dead for 2,000 years, and the experience is recognizably continuous with what happened in this theatre. when it was new. The story holds the attention. The attention creates a space in which something can enter and change how you think about things. The particular things that tonight's story might change, whether they are thoughts about civilization and its fragility, or about the relationship between human ambition and geological time, or simply about a place in the desert that you might want to visit someday, that is not for the storyteller to know. The story goes out and does its work in the dark, and what work it does is between the story and the listener. Beyond the theatre, the colonnaded street runs straight and long toward the far end of the valley, where the great temple complex stands. Some of the columns have been re-erected in recent years by archaeological teams working to restore some sense of what the street looked like in its active period. They are not all original in their positions, but they suggest the character of the street when it was lined with columns on both sides, and the shops behind the columns were open, and the crowds of the trading city were moving along the paved surface, and the sounds of commerce and conversation and animal movement filled the air. We walk the length of the street slowly. There is no need for speed. On either side, the outlines of ancient shops and public buildings are visible in the low foundations and scattered blocks. Some of these were elaborate buildings in their time, with plastered and painted walls and mosaic floors and carved stone decorations. Time and weather and the recycling of building materials have reduced them to foundations, but the foundations are still there, and they give the street its character even in its reduced state. At the far end of the street, the Temple of Qasr al-Bint stands. It is the most substantial freestanding structure in Petra, and it still communicates the scale and ambition of the Nabataean building program. The walls that remain are high enough to be impressive, and the massive blocks of stone from which they are built speak to the organizational capacity required to cut, transport, and assemble them. This was not a small undertaking. This was a statement, in stone, about the seriousness and the wealth and the religious life of the Nabataean civilization. We stand in front of it for a moment, looking up at the surviving walls, trying to imagine the complete building that stood here 2,000 years ago. The imagination is inadequate. It always is, with ancient buildings. The photographs and reconstructions that archaeologists produce help, but they cannot convey the full experience of standing inside a complete building of this scale, with its plastered and painted walls, and its incense burning in the interior, and the sound of priests performing the rituals that maintain the relationship between the city and its gods. We accept the imagination's inadequacy and appreciate what is actually here, the surviving walls, and the massive scale, and the ancient stone, and the late afternoon light that is just now reaching the western face of the building and beginning to warm its color from grey to gold. The walk up to the high place takes about 30 minutes from the valley floor, on the path that climbs the ridge to the south of the theatre. The path is ancient, as all paths in Petra are. Steps are cut into the rock at the steeper sections, worn smooth by the feet of 2,000 years of climbers. The view opens gradually as you climb. The valley floor, visible through gaps in the ridge, shows the colonnaded street and the temple complex in plan, laid out below you in a way that no ground-level view can achieve. The relationship between the major structures becomes clear from this height. You can see how the processional approach to the great temple was organized, how the theatre related to the market area, how the water channel from the Sikh fed into the distribution system for the valley. At the top of the ridge, the high place opens up. The carved altar, the basin for ritual washing, the two obelisks cut from the ridge itself, standing against the sky, and the view. The view from the high place of sacrifice in Petra looks out across the entire valley and the surrounding mountains in all directions. To the east, the great cliff of the royal tombs. To the north, the narrow entrance of the Sikh. To the south, the valley narrows again toward the back wall of the mountains. To the west, the landscape opens toward the Wadi Araba and the distant hills of the Negev. This is the center of the world, in the Nabataean understanding. This peak above their city, where the sky was closest and the landscape was most fully visible, where the smoke of sacrifices would be visible from the farthest distances, where the relationship between the city and the gods could be maintained in the most direct and visible way. We stand here for as long as the moment requires. There is no particular reason to leave quickly. The evening is coming on. The light on the valley below is going warm and orange. The carved facades on the eastern cliff are catching the last rays of the setting sun and glowing in colors that have no name. Below us, the ancient city is quiet. The tourists have mostly gone. The vendors have packed their goods. The horses and camels that carry visitors through the valley are being led back to their overnight pasture on the plateau above. And the stone is, as it always is, present, patient, red. We have been here all night, in the way that a story takes you to places without moving you. And now, the story is ending, as all stories end, with the return to silence. The Nabataeans are gone. Their city remains. The trade routes have shifted. The incense still smells the same when it burns. The earthquakes came, the water stopped, the people left, and the carved faces are still looking out from the cliff walls, as they have been looking out for 2,000 years, seeing nothing and everything, patient in the way that only stone can be patient. The rose-red city, half as old as time, still there, still red, still waiting. Good night. History for sleep. There is one more thing, a small thing, but it belongs here. Somewhere in the Petra Valley, probably in a location that has not yet been excavated, there is a deposit of Nabataean pottery that includes the work of a single craftsman who worked in the city sometime in the 1st century CE. We know this craftsman through their work. The particular way they painted the vine scrolls on their bowls, the distinctive angle of the brushwork on the lip, the slightly unusual proportion of the vessel forms they preferred. These are identifiable across a number of surviving examples in museums and private collections, enough to constitute a body of work that a careful observer can recognize and attribute. We do not know this craftsman's name. We do not know their gender, their family, their religion, their age, whether they were enslaved or free, whether they died young or old, whether they had children who carried on their work. We know only the bowls, and through the bowls, the hand, and through the hand, the faintest ghost of a person who sat in a workshop in Petra 2,000 years ago and painted vine scrolls on thin clay walls in the afternoon light. This is what survival looks like in the end. Not the grand facades, not the famous monuments, a pair of hands that knew their work, the bowls they made, the careful repetition of a gesture, a vine, a scroll, a single brushstroke, repeated thousands of times until it was perfect. That is also Petra. That is also the Nabataeans. Good night. The desert does not grieve for the things that pass through it. The caravan bells are gone, the merchants are gone, the priests and the kings and the craftsmen and the caravan drivers are all gone. The desert simply remains, as it was before them, as it will be after us. Red and patient and indifferent to human time in the way that only geological things can be. And inside the desert, the Red Canyon. And inside the canyon, the city. And inside the city, the carved faces. And inside the carved faces, something that outlasts everything. The mark of a human hand on the surface of the world. The evidence, cut into the living rock, that we were here. That we saw the light on the stone. That we thought it was worth making something to honor it. That is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep now. The canyon will be there in the morning. It will be there for a long time yet.